Hey everyone, today we're stepping back into a 1970s American school cafeteria where the refrigerator hummed behind the serving line, metal pans disappeared into a steam table, and small cartons of milk waited in neat rows beside stacks of divided trays. Of all the lunches printed on the monthly calendar, few created more excitement than rectangular cheese pizza with corn. The pizza was rarely round, rarely crisp, and almost never looked like the picture on a restaurant sign, yet children could recognize its arrival before they reached the counter. Tomato sauce, melted cheese, warm bread, canned corn, and the mixed smell of floor cleaner and cafeteria cooking somehow announced that this was not an ordinary lunch day. Over the course of this journey, we'll revisit 30 school cafeteria meals that many children of the 1970s loved, traded, tolerated, or quietly studied, before deciding whether they were hungry enough to continue. These were not identical in every district, but together they formed a lunchroom language that millions of students still understand. Before we pick up the first tray, consider liking and subscribing. If you enjoy forgotten American foods, grocery habits, kitchen rules, and family traditions from the 1960s and 1970s. And tell us in the comments, which school lunch do you remember most clearly, and what meal did your own family serve at home that tasted completely different from the cafeteria version? The lunches on this list earned their place not simply because they appeared on menus, but because they created a complete memory. There was the printed calendar taped near the classroom door, the smell drifting into the hallway before noon, the sound of trays sliding across metal rails, and the silent calculations children made about what could be traded. A true cafeteria memory was never only food. It included the line, the lunch money, the table, the friends, the rules, and the moment someone opened a milk carton badly enough to create a small dairy emergency. Pizza Day contained all of these elements, which is why it belongs at the beginning. The rectangular pizza usually arrived cut from a large sheet pan or removed from an institutional baking tray in neat portions designed to fit the largest compartment. Its crust was soft and bread-like, sometimes pale underneath, and darker along the edges with a layer of tomato sauce that could be sweet mild or surprisingly generous. The cheese formed a single melted surface, occasionally browned in spots, and occasionally sliding toward one corner as the tray moved down the line. Depending on the school, the topping might be plain cheese-seasoned ground meat or small pieces of sausage, but the basic shape remained unforgettable. This was pizza translated into the language of large kitchens, easy to portion, easy to count, and capable of feeding several hundred children within a narrow lunch schedule. The square or rectangle was not merely a design choice. It helped cafeteria workers arrange pieces, efficiently control serving size, and move trays through the line without turning lunch into a geometry lesson involving round pies and unequal slices. The students, of course, were less interested in portion control. They were studying the corners, because everyone knew the corner piece had more crust and therefore a completely different legal status. Beside the pizza sat corn in many schools, usually bright yellow kernels lifted from a steam table pan with a measured scoop. The pairing made practical sense even when children found it mysterious. A school lunch had to be assembled from several components, and corn was economical, familiar, easy to store, and simple to serve in large quantities. It also added colour to a tray dominated by red sauce, pale crust, and white or orange cheese. Some children ate the corn first. Others ignored it until the pizza was gone and then pushed it into a compact pile with the edge of a fork. A few placed the kernels directly on top of the pizza, either as an experiment or because the lunch period was short and efficiency had become necessary. The corn could be joined by applesauce, canned peaches, green beans, or a small portion of salad depending on the district and season. A warm roll would have been unnecessary beside pizza, although cafeteria menus did not always allow the concept of unnecessary bread to interfere with tradition. Then came the milk carton cold enough to dampen the tray beneath it, and stubborn enough to resist opening when the printed arrows offered more confidence than actual assistance. The anticipation began long before the first slice appeared. Teachers or school offices often distributed monthly menus, and families could see which days were safe for buying lunch and which days might justify a packed sandwich. Children learned to read these calendars strategically. Pizza Day could influence whether lunch money was requested, whether a metal lunchbox stayed home, and whether anyone attempted to trade away dessert before the main course arrived. In some classrooms, the morning lunch count became a small public vote. Hands rose for the cafeteria meal, and pizza could produce a level of participation that meatloaf rarely enjoyed. By noon, the line seemed longer, the conversation louder, and the possibility of second helpings almost entirely theoretical. Cafeteria workers had to bake cold cut and serve enough portions while keeping the cheese from cooling into a firm lid. Their work was repetitive, physical, and timed with little room for delay. One pan removed too early could be pale. One pan held too long could develop edges capable of challenging a fork. Yet children usually accepted the variation. Restaurant pizza was judged by quality. School pizza was judged by whether you received it before the bell. What made the rectangular slice so memorable was not that it represented the finest pizza of the decade. It represented a school day briefly improved by the menu. The slice arrived in the same building where children faced spelling tests, multiplication tables, gym class, scraped knees, and the complicated politics of choosing a cafeteria seat. For 20 minutes, the most important question might be whether the cheese would remain attached after the first bite. Pizza also reflected a broader change in school food. Cafeterias still served older home-style meals such as gravy stews, casseroles, and sliced meats, but they were increasingly making room for foods children associated with restaurant snack bars, frozen food aisles, and convenience. The transformation was uneven, and many kitchens continued preparing meals largely from basic ingredients, but the menu was beginning to speak more directly to children's tastes. The rectangular pizza sat at the center of that transition, institutional, but exciting, standardized but locally remembered, imperfect, but protected by nostalgia. And once the pizza tray was cleared, the next lunch arrived on a softer bun carrying enough tomato-seasoned ground beef to escape from both sides before anyone reached the table. A soft hamburger bun waited at the center of the tray, but by the time it reached the table, the filling had usually escaped far beyond its assigned borders. The Sloppy Joe was one of the 1970s cafeteria's most dependable hot sandwiches, built from ground beef simmered with tomato sauce, onion seasoning, and enough sweetness to make it familiar even to children who distrusted nearly everything else coming from the steam table. Some versions were thick enough to sit in a tidy mound. Others soaked into the lower half of the bun until the bread could no longer be lifted without assistance from a fork. The top bun was often placed at an angle less like a lid and more like a suggestion. Beside it might sit baked beans, potato rounds, canned fruit, shredded cabbage, or a small serving of vegetables selected partly for nutrition and partly because the cafeteria had to complete hundreds of trays before the first lunch period ended. The sandwich was messy, inexpensive, recognizable, and easy to prepare in enormous kettles. It also gave children a rare meal that seemed to announce its own personality. No one had ever promised that a Sloppy Joe would behave. The sound of its preparation began hours earlier when cafeteria workers browned large amounts of ground meat, drained it, and stirred in sauce with long-handled paddles. Large institutional kitchens relied on repetition and timing. Buns had to be opened, Pans refilled portions measured and trays kept moving while the lunch line grew behind the doors. The Sloppy Joe suited that system because the filling could be cooked in quantity and held warm without requiring every serving to look identical. A measured scoop landed on each lower bun, although gravity soon made its own adjustments. In some districts, the sauce leaned sweet and tomato-heavy. In others, it tasted sharper, more savoury, or more strongly of the onion. Children who knew the meal from home sometimes compared the cafeteria version with a parent's skillet recipe, a canned sauce, or a family mixture that included mustard, brown sugar, or whatever remained in the refrigerator. The school version rarely won that comparison, but it did not need to. It belonged to the lunchroom where flavour shared importance with speed, affordability, and the ability to survive 10 minutes beneath a metal cover. The first bite required planning. A student could hold the bun firmly with both hands and risk squeezing the filling onto the tray, or lift one side carefully while keeping a fork ready beneath it. The most confident children simply leaned forward and accepted the consequences. Sauce marked napkins, fingertips, shirt cuffs, and occasionally the edge of a worksheet that had been brought to lunch against better judgment. Potato rounds or fries, when served beside it, became useful tools for collecting what had fallen. The bun itself changed as the meal continued. Its upper half stayed dry and slightly chewy, while the bottom softened into something halfway between bread and sauce. This was not necessarily a flaw. For many children, the soaked portion was the best part, although admitting that in front of friends could require courage. The Sloppy Joe also created a different kind of trading economy. A child might surrender canned pears or green beans for another carton of milk, but the sandwich rarely moved intact from one tray to another. It was too unstable for negotiation. Once served, it had chosen its owner. Across the country, another sauced sandwich appeared under names that could change from one town to the next. Barbecued beef barbecue burger, barbecue sandwich, or simply barbecue on a bun might describe shredded beef chopped meat, or ground beef coated in a darker, smokier, or tangier sauce than the Sloppy Joe. In some cafeterias, the distinction between the two meals was obvious. In others, it depended largely on what the menu calendar happened to call them. The barbecued beef sandwich often looked more serious with deeper coloured sauce, and meat that formed strands or small pieces rather than a loose ground mixture. It could arrive with baked beans, coleslaw, corn potato salad, or a scoop of fruit. The smell was stronger than the Sloppy Joes reaching the hallway with tomato vinegar, onion, and warm bread. For children from families with established barbecue traditions, however, the school sandwich might have had very little connection to what the word meant at home. Regional barbecue could involve long cooking, specific meat smoke, carefully guarded sauces, and strong local loyalties. The cafeteria version had a different assignment. It needed to be affordable, easy to portion, and willing to wait in a pan. That difference made the barbecued beef sandwich a small lesson in how American school food worked. Cafeteria menus often borrowed familiar names while adapting dishes to available equipment, purchasing contracts, labor, and local expectations. A child in one state might receive finely crumbled beef in a sweet red sauce. Another might find shredded meat in a thinner mixture. A third might know a loose meat sandwich with only enough sauce to hold everything together. None of these experiences could stand for every 1970s school, yet the general scene remained recognizable. A bun placed in the large tray compartment, a scoop of sauced meat beans steaming beside it, and a milk carton threatening to tip whenever the tray tilted. Some cooks prepared sauce from pantry ingredients. Other kitchens relied more heavily on prepared products or district recipes. The results depended on budget, staff, kitchen size, and the number of students waiting to be fed. Convenience was never complete. Even the easiest sandwich still required ordering thawing, browning, mixing, portioning, serving, and cleaning a kettle large enough to make an ordinary home saucepan seem decorative. These two sandwiches lasted in memory because they belonged to ordinary school days rather than celebrations. They were not holiday meals, and they did not create the excitement of rectangular pizza. They arrived on rainy Tuesdays, cold Thursdays, and afternoons when students still had spelling social studies and gym ahead of them. Their sauces made them warmer and more generous looking than a plain hamburger, while the buns made them feel less formal than meatloaf or roast dinners. They also revealed the quiet arithmetic of cafeteria cooking. A modest amount of meat could be stretched with sauce and served quickly to a large room without appearing quite so modest. For children, the calculation was simpler. Was the bun intact? Were the beans touching the sandwich? Could the filling be eaten before it reached the tray? These were the questions that mattered beneath the cafeteria lights. But sauced sandwiches were only one way ground beef entered the school kitchen. On another day the bun disappeared. The meat was pressed into an oval patty, and brown gravy flowed across the tray toward a carefully measured hill of mashed potatoes. The brown gravy appeared before the meat did, spreading across the tray in a glossy stream that seemed determined to reach every neighbouring compartment. At the centre sat a Salisbury steak, usually oval, evenly shaped and far more orderly than anything formed by hand in a family kitchen. It might have been made from ground beef blended with crumb seasoning and other practical ingredients that helped it hold together through cooking, holding and serving. The patty arrived beneath onions in some schools and completely alone in others, but almost always with mashed potatoes close enough to absorb the gravy. Green beans, peas, corn canned fruit, or a soft dinner roll filled the remaining spaces. This was not a lunch designed to create the excitement of pizza day. It carried the authority of a full dinner served before 1 o'clock, the kind of tray that seemed to expect good posture and serious use of a fork. Even children who did not know what Salisbury meant understood the basic message today. The cafeteria wanted everyone to eat something respectable. The steam table controlled the experience. Metal pans sat above hot water, keeping patties, potatoes, vegetables and gravy warm as several lunch periods moved through the room. A cafeteria worker lifted the lid, releasing a cloud of steam, then used a spatula or portioning utensil to place one patty in the largest compartment. Another worker added mashed potatoes with a scoop that created nearly identical rounded hills on every tray. Gravy followed from a ladle, and the amount could determine the entire success of the meal. Too little, and the potatoes remained dry around the edges. Too much, and the tray became a brown river system, with green beans living on a rapidly shrinking island. The routine looked simple from the student side of the counter, but the kitchen had already spent hours preparing heating, organizing and timing the food. Every pan had to be ready when the line began. Every serving had to be generous enough to satisfy and controlled enough to ensure that the final lunch period did not receive an explanation instead of an entree. Salisbury steak worked well in a large institutional kitchen because it offered the appearance of an individual portion while using ground meat that could be shaped and seasoned consistently. It belonged to an older style of American meal planning in which meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread and milk formed a complete and recognizable lunch. Some students knew a similar dish from frozen television dinners, family suppers, diners, or recipes made at home. Others encountered it mainly beneath cafeteria lights, where the patty could be tender, firm, pleasantly seasoned, or mysterious enough to encourage careful inspection with a fork. The gravy softened nearly everything it touched, including the edges of the roll, if the tray tilted during the walk to the table. Children developed different strategies. Some mixed the meat and potatoes, immediately creating a single brown and white landscape. Others kept every component separate and defended the borders with determination. A few used the roll to wipe the tray cleaner method that was practical, efficient, and technically capable of turning bread into a second serving of gravy. On another day, the same steam table might hold meatloaf sliced into rectangles and arranged in overlapping rows inside a deep metal pan. Unlike Salisbury steak, which arrived as a carefully formed individual patty, meatloaf carried the visible evidence of having begun as one large mass. Each slice showed its interior, sometimes smooth and uniform, sometimes dotted with onion seasoning or small pieces of vegetables. A red tomato-based glaze might cover the top, although many school versions relied on brown gravy instead. The slice was placed beside mashed potatoes with green beans, corn peas, or carrots completing the tray. Meatloaf was familiar enough to seem safe but personal enough to invite comparison. Nearly every child who ate it at home had an opinion about whose version was correct. Some families used crackers, others used breadcrumbs, oats, onions, ketchup, tomato sauce, or nothing that could be easily identified. The cafeteria version entered this debate without defending itself. It simply appeared in a straight-sided slice and waited for judgment. That judgment often depended on texture. A good slice held together when lifted, but yielded easily beneath the fork. A less successful one resisted cutting or broke apart before reaching the mouth. The steam table essential for keeping hundreds of meals warm could also continue changing food after it was cooked. Gravy thickened. Potato surfaces dried slightly. Meatloaf edges became firmer. Vegetables softened while waiting for the next group of students to arrive. Children eating during the first lunch period sometimes received food that looked and tasted different from what reached the final group. Yet the meal remained deeply connected to the idea of home cooking. It brought familiar dinner foods into the middle of the school day and turned them into standardized portions. At home, one child might receive an end piece with extra glaze while another avoided onions. In the cafeteria, personal preference had very little influence on the serving utensil. Everyone moved forward, received the official slice, and considered whether any unwanted vegetables could be exchanged before they cooled completely. Both Salisbury steak and meatloaf reveal how the 1970s school cafeteria balanced comfort with control. These meals used recognizable ingredients, stretched budgets sensibly, and could be prepared in quantities large enough for an entire building. They also gave lunch a form that adults considered substantial. A sandwich might feel casual, but meat with gravy and potatoes looked like a proper meal, even when served on a divided tray and eaten beneath a clock that allowed very little time for reflection. The memory that remained was often less about the exact seasoning than the arrangement: oval patty or rectangular slice, pale potatoes, brown gravy, green vegetables, cold milk, and perhaps a warm roll placed wherever space remained. The steam table gave each component the same soft warmth and tied them together into one unmistakable cafeteria experience. But brown gravy did not rule every day. Soon the deep pans changed colour, the ladle emerged coated in tomato sauce, and long noodles began slipping from forks, while elbow macaroni waited nearby under a name that changed from one region to another. The spaghetti announced itself before the cafeteria doors opened. Tomato sauce, browned meat, onions, and warm bread sent a familiar smell into the hallway, where children waiting for lunch could begin deciding whether the day's meal deserved enthusiasm. On the tray, the noodles usually occupied the largest compartment in a loose red mound, with meat sauce ladled across the top and a slice of bread placed along one edge. Some schools served a soft roll, others offered plain white bread spread with margarine, and a few managed something close to garlic bread. The noodles were rarely firm enough to impress an Italian grandmother, but firmness was not their main assignment. They had to be cooked in large quantities, held warm, portioned quickly, and eaten by children using forks that sometimes seemed designed for a less ambitious food. Green beans, corn salad, applesauce, or canned fruit completed the tray. A small amount of grated cheese might appear on top, although in many lunchrooms the sauce carried the entire responsibility. Red Sauce Day was messy, filling, economical, and instantly recognizable. Eating cafeteria spaghetti required technique. The noodles were long enough to resist the fork, but soft enough to slide away at the final moment. Some students attempted to twirl them properly, gathering a careful bundle before lifting it toward the mouth. Others cut the noodles into shorter pieces with the side of the fork, reducing the meal to something more manageable and perhaps less dignified. The most impatient simply lifted what they could and hoped the remaining strands would not land on a shirt. Tomato sauce marked napkins, fingertips, tray edges, and the corners of mouths that would not be discovered until the next class. The bread served several practical purposes. It could push loose noodles onto the fork, absorb extra sauce, or clean the compartment after the pasta was gone. Children who disliked vegetables sometimes placed the bread between the spaghetti and the green beans, creating a barrier with the structural ambition of a small dam. The milk carton waited nearby, offering relief from the sauce while creating its own opening problems. By the end of lunch, the tray often looked as though the spaghetti had attempted an escape and nearly succeeded. Behind the serving line, spaghetti was valuable because a relatively modest amount of meat could flavor a large quantity of pasta and sauce. Cafeteria workers browned ground beef, stirred deep kettles, drained noodles, filled pans, and tried to prevent the pasta from becoming one solid block before the final lunch period arrived. Institutional recipes favored measurable ingredients and predictable yields. The sauce might include canned tomatoes, tomato paste, onions, dried seasonings, and enough liquid to remain pourable beneath the heat. Some districts mixed the noodles and sauce before serving. Others placed the sauce on top, allowing children to decide whether every strand needed to become red. The result varied from school to school, and sometimes from one lunch period to the next. Early trays could receive loose noodles and a generous ladle of sauce. Later trays might encounter pasta that had absorbed more liquid and sauce that had thickened with patience. Yet spaghetti remained popular because it looked familiar. Children knew what it was supposed to be even when the cafeteria version had developed its own accent. A few menu days later, the long noodles disappeared, and elbow macaroni entered the same tomato-coloured world. Chili mac combined ground beef, macaroni, tomato sauce seasoning, and sometimes beans into a meal that could be prepared in one large kettle or pan. In other districts, a similar dish appeared as goulash, American goulash beef and macaroni, or American chop suey. The names varied so widely that two former students could describe nearly the same lunch, while insisting they had eaten completely different dishes. In some cafeterias, chili mac was thick, mildly spicy, and unmistakably related to chili. In others, it was a softer tomato and macaroni casserole with very little heat. Beans might be present, absent, or discussed as though their inclusion represented a serious violation of local law. Cheese could be stirred into the mixture, scattered on top, or left out entirely. What united the versions was their practicality. Macaroni was inexpensive, easy to portion, familiar to children, and capable of carrying a small amount of meat through a surprisingly large number of servings. The elbows also behaved better than spaghetti. They stayed on the fork, remained mostly inside their compartment, and did not require twirling, cutting, or a willingness to wear lunch. A portion scoop produced a rounded serving that held its shape for several seconds before settling into the tray. Crackers, bread, corn peas, or fruit might appear beside it, depending on how the district classified the meal and what ingredients were available. Children sometimes mixed corn directly into the chili mac, either deliberately or because the tray had tilted during the walk to the table. Others crushed crackers over the top, creating a dry layer that absorbed sauce and added a little crunch before becoming soft. The dish could be comforting on a cold day, especially when steam rose from the tray and the cafeteria windows looked grey. It could also be heavy enough to make afternoon classes feel unusually long. Chili Mac did not possess pizza's glamour, but it had reliability. It filled the compartment, stayed warm, and rarely created confusion about whether lunch had been substantial. Both spaghetti and Chili Mac show how the 1970s cafeteria used pasta to balance cost-labor familiarity and appetite. These dishes stretched ground meat without making the tray look empty, relied on pantry ingredients that could be stored in quantity, and allowed cooks to feed hundreds of students from a manageable number of kettles and pans. They also reflected regional language and household memory. One child recognized cafeteria goulash as nearly identical to a family supper. Another had never heard the name until it appeared on the school calendar. Some remembered sauce that was sweet, others remember pepper onions or cheese, and some remember mainly the piece of bread used to rescue whatever remained. The red sauce connected the meals, but the shapes created different experiences. Spaghetti slipped and tangled, while macaroni stayed obediently within reach. When those pans were finally washed, the next cafeteria meals abandoned tomato sauce for something darker and slower. Large kettles filled with chili beef stew, carrots, potatoes, and broth, while warm rolls waited nearby for the coldest lunch days of the year. The chili usually appeared in a deep compartment or a small bowl set carefully on the tray, dark red beneath the cafeteria lights, and thick enough to hold the mark of the serving ladle for several seconds. In many 1970s schools it was a cold-weather lunch, the kind that seemed more convincing when coats were hanging from classroom hooks and wet boots had left dark marks across the hallway floor. Ground beef, beans, tomatoes, onions, and mild seasoning formed the basic mixture, although no two districts appeared to agree on the proper balance. Some versions were thick and crowded with beans, others contained more sauce than substance, and required crackers simply to become manageable. A small cellophane packet often waited beside the bowl, holding 2 pale crackers that broke into crumbs the moment impatient fingers opened the wrapper. Children crushed them over the chili, dipped them one at a time, or saved them until the end when the liquid had cooled enough to stop threatening the roof of the mouth. Cheese might appear in some cafeterias, but many students remember a plainer arrangement: chili crackers, fruit, perhaps a vegetable, and the nearly unavoidable carton of milk. Large kettles made chili practical for a school kitchen. Cafeteria workers could brown meat, add canned tomatoes, or tomato products stir in beans and seasonings, and prepare enough servings for several lunch periods without assembling hundreds of individual portions. The meal also allowed ingredients to stretch quietly. Beans and sauce increased the volume while a smaller amount of meat flavoured the entire kettle. During a decade when food costs placed pressure on many household and institutional budgets, such meals offered warmth and substance without requiring an expensive portion of meat for every tray. Yet convenience did not mean effortless preparation. Someone still had to open cans, measure ingredients, stir a heavy kettle, prevent the bottom from scorching, refill serving pans, and wash equipment after the final group returned to class. The children saw one ladle descend into a bowl. The kitchen staff had already completed hours of work. Chili could also become thicker as it waited, meaning the first lunch period might receive something close to soup, while the last received a mixture capable of supporting a cracker without assistance. The lunchroom response depended on what children believed chili was supposed to contain. A student from a family that made a spicy version at home might find the cafeteria bowl unusually mild. Another child might object to beans, onions, or any visible piece of tomato. Regional habits mattered, and school recipes were usually designed to satisfy a broad audience rather than defend one local theory of chili. Heat was often restrained, partly because the kitchen had to feed hundreds of children with different tolerances and very little time for negotiation. Hot sauce, if it appeared at all, was not always available to students. The result was a meal that adults might describe as dependable, and children might describe according to whichever ingredient had offended them most. Even so, chili invited participation. Crackers could be crushed into powder arranged around the edge, or used as edible spoons. Some students stirred corn into the bowl when tray compartments overflowed. Others dipped a sandwich or roll into it. A child who disliked the beans could spend most of lunch moving them from one side of the bowl to the other, an activity that produced no nutritional improvement but demonstrated admirable persistence. Beef stew arrived from another kettle carrying a different smell and a more recognizable collection of pieces. Brown broth surrounded cubes or small portions of beef potatoes, carrots, peas, celery, onions, or whatever combination the district recipe and available supplies supported. The vegetables were usually soft after cooking and holding their edges rounded by hours of heat. Potatoes might remain in firm cubes or begin dissolving into the broth, making it thicker as lunch progressed. The meat could be tender enough to separate with a fork or firm enough to remind students that institutional cooking involved schedules rather than individual requests. Unlike Salisbury steak, stew did not divide neatly into one piece per child. A ladle determined the serving, and children immediately inspected whether it had delivered a fair amount of beef or mainly potatoes and gravy. This was the cafeteria version of luck. One tray received several promising pieces. The next appeared to have been assigned responsibility for the carrots. The worker behind the counter could stir the pan before serving, but no ladle could guarantee complete equality. A warm yeast roll often changed the reputation of the entire stew tray. It might be soft, slightly sweet, and brushed with margarine, with a pale interior that compressed beneath the fingers before slowly rising again. In schools where rolls were prepared or finished in the cafeteria kitchen, their smell could travel farther than the stew itself. Even students uncertain about the main dish understood the purpose of the bread. It absorbed broth, collected gravy from the corners, and provided something familiar when the vegetables became too ambitious. Some children opened the roll and placed pieces of beef inside, turning a kettle meal into a small sandwich. Others ate it immediately, then regretted the decision when broth remained at the bottom of the compartment with nothing left to retrieve it. The roll was also valuable for trade, although a fresh one rarely stayed available long enough to reach the bargaining stage. A student might surrender canned peaches or cooked carrots, but warm bread possessed a stronger currency. It was simple, portable, and free from the uncertainty that surrounded an unidentified cube in the stew. Chili and beef stew belonged to the practical heart of the 1970s cafeteria. They used deep kettles, stored ingredients, careful portioning, and the ability of beans, potatoes, vegetables, broth, and bread to make a modest quantity of meat feel like a complete meal. They were especially suited to winter, but their real season was the school budget. These dishes could feed a large number of children, remain warm through several lunch periods, and fit the adult expectation that noon food should provide enough strength for the rest of the day. The memories they left were not always glamorous. They included cracker dust on the tray, carrots pushed beneath the napkin, a roll saved too long, and the suspense of watching a ladle search the bottom of a pan for one more piece of beef. Yet there was comfort in the steam, the warm bread, and the knowledge that the bowl would be filled. When the kettles were emptied, the cafeteria turned toward a paler kind of comfort. Wide noodles, shredded chicken peas biscuits, and cream sauce began gathering beneath the metal lids. Wide noodles arrived in a pale mound glossy with broth or light gravy, and threaded with pieces of chicken that seemed to appear only after careful searching. In many Midwestern cafeterias, chicken and noodles carried the feeling of a family supper into the middle of the school day. The noodles were softer and broader than spaghetti built to hold sauce rather than escape from the fork, and they often shared the tray with peas, carrots, mashed potatoes, or a warm roll. In some districts, the chicken mixture was spooned directly over the potatoes, creating a double layer of starch that would puzzle modern menu planners, but made perfect sense to children raised in households where noodles and potatoes were not competitors. They were partners. The result was warm, mild filling and almost entirely beige until green peas entered the scene. Those peas might remain in their own compartment, migrate into the noodles, or be pressed one by one beneath the edge of the mashed potatoes by a child conducting a very slow disappearance. Chicken and noodles suited the institutional kitchen because the dish could make careful use of every ingredient. Cooked chicken could be shredded, or chopped broth could carry its flavour through a large quantity of noodles, and vegetables added colour and helped complete the tray. The meal did not require one perfect piece of meat for each student. Instead, the chicken was distributed throughout the pan, at least in theory. Children understood that theory, and also understood the importance of the serving spoon. One scoop might contain several visible pieces. The next might contain noodles broth, and a single fragment of chicken small enough to require official identification. Cafeteria workers stirred the pans to keep the portions reasonably even, but several hundred lunches made exact fairness impossible. The noodles continued absorbing liquid while they waited beneath metal lids, becoming thicker and softer as the lunch periods passed. Students eating early might receive a loose soupy mixture. Students eating late sometimes received something closer to a casserole that had decided to abandon the baking dish. For children who knew chicken and noodles from home, the school version invited immediate comparison. A family recipe might begin with a whole chicken, simmered for broth noodles rolled and cut by hand, or a pot watched closely by someone who knew exactly when the dough was ready. The cafeteria version had a different purpose. It had to be predictable, affordable, safe to hold, and easy to portion. It was usually seasoned gently enough for a room full of young diners, which meant some students found it comforting while others reached for salt before tasting it. The peas became the main point of disagreement. Mixed directly into the sauce, they were impossible to avoid without turning lunch into an excavation project. Served separately, they could be traded, ignored, or eaten quickly before their warmth disappeared. A roll offered security, especially when dipped into the broth. The milk carton supplied contrast, although drinking cold milk after warm chicken gravy was one of those school traditions that no child had designed and few adults felt required to explain. A related meal appeared beneath a more elegant name, chicken a la king. The title suggested a dish prepared for royalty, but the cafeteria tray usually presented a practical mixture of chopped chicken peas and sometimes carrots or peppers suspended in a creamy sauce. It might be poured over toast rice, a split biscuit, or a square of bread depending on the district and the kitchen. The biscuit version created the strongest visual memory. A round or rectangular biscuit sat in the main compartment until a ladle of cream sauce covered its top and flowed around its base. For several seconds the bread remained distinct. Then it began absorbing the sauce, softening from the outside inward, until the bottom could be cut with the edge of a fork. Children who liked biscuits sometimes tried to rescue part of one before the sauce completed its work. Others welcomed the transformation and mashed everything together, turning chicken peas, gravy and bread into one warm mixture that required very little chewing and almost no formal dining technique. The name itself gave the lunch an air of ambition. Cafeteria menus could turn ordinary ingredients into something special, simply by printing a more impressive description on the monthly calendar. Chicken in cream sauce sounded practical. Chicken a la king sounded as though someone might have placed a napkin across an arm before serving it. The meal's actual success depended on texture. The sauce needed to remain smooth. While waiting in a steam table, the chicken had to stay tender, and the biscuit had to retain enough structure to be recognized as bread. When all three cooperated, the lunch could be deeply comforting. When the sauce thickened too much, it settled over the biscuit like plaster. When it remained thin, it travelled freely into the vegetable compartment. The peas, meanwhile, floated in the mixture with complete confidence, making avoidance difficult. This was one reason cream sauce meals divided opinion so sharply. A child either accepted the whole arrangement or spent 20 minutes separating ingredients that had been designed to remain together. Both chicken and noodles and chicken a la king reflected an older school lunch ideal that valued hot, complete meals assembled from familiar components. They were economical, without looking empty, mild enough for broad acceptance, and adaptable to the ingredients, equipment, and traditions of different districts. They also showed how much cafeteria cooking depended on transformation. Broth stretched chicken through noodles. Cream sauce turned small pieces of meat and vegetables into a main course. A biscuit made the tray appear more generous while absorbing whatever the ladle provided. Behind every serving stood the work of cooks who opened cans, prepared pans, stirred sauces, watched temperatures, counted portions, and tried to keep bread from becoming completely soft before the final bell. For students, the memory remained simpler. Pale noodles, green peas, a biscuit disappearing beneath gravy, and the small hope that today's scoop would contain more chicken than yesterday's. Soon the cafeteria would abandon its ordinary weekday colours. Turkey dressing, cranberry sauce, and gravy would arrive together, compressing an entire Thanksgiving table into the narrow borders of a divided tray. The Thanksgiving tray announced itself by colour before anyone reached the serving line. Brown gravy covered pale slices or pieces of turkey, orange sweet potatoes or carrots filled one compartment, green beans occupied another, and a dark spoonful of cranberry sauce waited near the edge like a decoration no one had agreed to eat. In many 1970s schools, the holiday lunch appeared during the week before Thanksgiving, when construction paper turkeys hung on classroom walls and teachers had already begun explaining that the short school week still contained assignments. The cafeteria tried to place an entire family dinner onto one divided tray: turkey dressing, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, breadfruit or cranberry sauce, milk, and perhaps a small dessert. Every district arranged the meal differently, and some children received chopped turkey, a formed portion, or sliced poultry rather than the carved bird they knew from home. Still, the intention was unmistakable. Ordinary lunch had put on its holiday clothes, although it continued wearing the same tray. The turkey carried most of the expectation. At home, Thanksgiving poultry might be carved at the table, sliced from a platter, or served by a relative who believed every plate required both light and dark meat. In the cafeteria, it had to be purchased, cooked, or reheated, portioned, and served to hundreds of students before the bell-ended lunch. Some schools offered slices arranged beneath gravy. Others served chopped turkey mixed with sauce, while certain kitchens relied on institutional poultry portions that provided a consistent serving without requiring cafeteria workers to carve several birds during the busiest meal of the season. Children inspected the meat closely, comparing it with the version waiting at home later that week. A generous layer of gravy improved almost any result. It added warmth, softened dry edges, and connected the turkey to the potatoes and dressing. It also travelled freely whenever the tray tilted. By the time a student reached the table, gravy might have entered the green beans, touched the cranberry sauce, and begun negotiating with the dessert. The dressing or stuffing, depending on the family and region, created the strongest disagreement. One cafeteria pan might contain soft bread dressing flavored with onion, celery, poultry seasoning, or broth. Another might offer a firmer scoop that held the shape of the serving utensil. Children accustomed to cornbread dressing could regard a pale bread version with suspicion, while those raised with bread stuffing might find the darker regional style equally unfamiliar. School kitchens could not reproduce every family tradition, and Thanksgiving traditions were among the most personal foods in America. A child might expect sage because a grandmother used it generously. Another associated the holiday with sausage oysters, rice chestnuts, or a recipe brought from a different cultural tradition. The cafeteria version was built for broad service rather than family identity. It had to be mild, affordable, and willing to remain warm beneath a metal lid. Some students mixed it immediately with the potatoes and gravy. Others took one experimental bite and concentrated on the roll. The dressing may have represented the holiday, but the warm bread remained the safer diplomatic choice. Mashed potatoes gave the tray its foundation. A portion scoop placed a rounded hill beside the turkey, creating a shallow crater when gravy landed in the center. Whether prepared from fresh potatoes, dehydrated potato products, or a combination depended on the district kitchen labor and budget. To the child holding the fork, the distinction was often less important than the texture. Smooth potatoes accepted gravy easily. Stiffer potatoes could be cut into sections and used to protect other compartments. Thin potatoes spread outward until they met the dressing, at which point the two foods became almost impossible to separate. Green beans, peas, corn, carrots, or sweet potatoes added the required vegetables and holiday color, though they did not always receive holiday enthusiasm. Cranberry sauce created an even sharper division. Some students loved the sweet tart spoonful. Others stared at it as though the cafeteria had placed jam beside the gravy by mistake. When the sauce retained the ridged shape of a can, it provided one of the most recognizable sights on the tray, and one of the least successful items for trading. Dessert could rescue the entire meal. Depending on the school, the holiday tray might include pumpkin cake, spice, cake apple crisp, a cookie gelatin, canned fruit, or a square of something baked in the same large pans used throughout the year. A genuine slice of pumpkin pie was possible in some cafeterias, but it should not be imagined as universal. Whatever arrived, children often saved it until the end, protecting it from gravy with a napkin, an empty milk carton, or careful tray management. The dessert gave the meal a sense of occasion that vegetables alone could not provide. Even a simple cake square seemed more important when served beside turkey and dressing. Cafeteria workers understood the scale of the event better than anyone. Holiday lunch meant extra pans, more components, tighter timing, and children who expected the meal to feel special. Rolls had to remain warm, gravy had to remain pourable, turkey had to last through the final lunch period, and dessert portions had to be counted with the precision of valuable property. A shortage of green beans could be managed. A shortage of cake would become history. The Thanksgiving lunch remained memorable because it placed school and home beside each other on the same tray. It asked institutional cooking to imitate one of the most emotional family meals of the year, then served the result beneath fluorescent lights, with 20 minutes available for eating. For some children, the cafeteria version resembled home closely enough to feel comforting. For others, every component seemed slightly wrong. The dressing used the wrong bread. The cranberry sauce had the wrong shape. The potatoes needed more butter, and the turkey lacked the crisp skin that someone always claimed at the family table. Yet the meal still marked the calendar. It broke the routine of sandwiches, casseroles, and red sauce, and it recognized that food could help a school observe a season together. Once the trays were cleared, the construction paper turkeys remained on the walls, but the cafeteria returned to ordinary schedules. On Friday menus and other carefully planned days, breaded fish sticks lined up beside potatoes, while tuna noodles, peas, and cream sauce waited beneath a baked topping that rarely survived the steam table unchanged. The fish sticks arrived in straight breaded rows, golden on the outside and pale within, each one shaped with the reassuring precision of a food designed for counting. In many 1970s cafeterias they appeared on Fridays, although the reasons varied from district to district. Catholic communities often carried a strong tradition of meatless Friday meals, especially during Lent, but schools also served fish because frozen breaded portions were convenient, familiar, and easy to divide among hundreds of trays. 2 or 3 sticks might occupy the main compartment beside mashed potatoes, French fries, buttered noodles, green beans, or coleslaw. A small serving of tartar sauce waited nearby, either spooned from a container or sealed inside a packet that required more determination than its contents seemed to justify. The fish itself could be crisp when it first left the oven, but time beneath a cover softened the breading. By the final lunch period, the outside might have lost its crunch while the inside remained hot enough to demand caution. Children did not usually discuss moisture retention or institutional holding temperatures. They simply knew that the first bite could be soft, steaming, and unexpectedly serious. Tartar sauce determined the meal for many students. A good amount could make the fish seem familiar and mild, while too little left every breaded corner exposed. Some children dipped each piece carefully. Others spread the sauce across the entire row, creating a white layer beneath which the fish disappeared. Students who disliked tartar sauce relied on ketchup if the cafeteria provided it, while those who trusted neither condiment broke the sticks open and inspected the filling before continuing. The shape helped. Fish served as a fillet might have reminded nervous diners too clearly of its origin, but fish formed into rectangles belonged comfortably beside other cafeteria foods that had already accepted geometry as part of their identity. The sticks could be eaten with a fork picked up by hand, or placed inside a roll to create an improvised sandwich. Potatoes absorbed stray sauce and coleslaw presented its own challenge, especially when its dressing migrated across the tray. The meal was rarely anyone's idea of luxury, but it offered a predictable arrangement. Even a child who disliked fish could understand what every object on the tray was attempting to do. Behind the line, frozen breaded fish portions offered several advantages. They could be stored, counted, baked on large sheet pans and served without the bone skin or variable shapes that would have made fresh fish difficult in a school kitchen. This did not mean preparation required no skill. Cafeteria workers still had to manage oven space, arrange portions, so they cooked evenly coordinate side dishes and move pans quickly enough that the breading did not deteriorate before serving. A piece held too long could become soft. A piece baked too aggressively could dry at the edges. The kitchen also had to estimate demand because fish day did not always attract the same enthusiasm as pizza or hamburgers. Some students carried lunchboxes on those mornings, leaving the cafeteria with more portions than expected. In other schools, especially where Friday fish was familiar at home, the meal drew little resistance. The same tray could feel ordinary in one community and suspicious in another. School food memories were always local, even when the frozen cartons and portion scoops looked the same. Tuna noodle casserole created a different kind of fish day experience. Instead of separate breaded pieces, the tuna disappeared into a pale mixture of noodles, cream sauce peas, and sometimes celery, onions, cheese, or a baked topping. The casserole arrived in a rounded scoop or square portion depending on how firmly it had set in the pan. Wide noodles folded over one another. Bits of tuna appeared without warning, and green peas announced themselves against the cream-coloured sauce. At home, tuna casserole had already become a familiar economical meal in many households, helped by canned tuna condensed soup, dried noodles and ingredients that could remain in the pantry until needed. The cafeteria version used the same basic logic on a much larger scale. It stretched a comparatively small amount of tuna through enough noodles and sauce to feed a crowd, and it could be assembled in deep pans before lunch began. The topping might include crumbs, crushed crackers, or crisp noodles, but any crunch achieved in the oven had to survive the long wait beneath a metal lid. It rarely did. Trading tuna casserole was difficult because it did not travel well. A carton of milk could change owners. A roll could cross the table in one clean movement. Canned peaches could be exchanged with a spoon and a willing partner. Tuna casserole resisted all such diplomacy. Its spread clung to the tray and carried an aroma that identified it immediately. A student who disliked it had few bargaining options beyond offering dessert along with it, and even that proposal might be rejected. Children who enjoyed the dish, however, often found it comforting. The noodles were soft, the sauce was mild, and the tuna provided enough savory flavor to make the meal feel substantial. Peas remained the central controversy. Mixed through the casserole, they could not be pushed aside without taking noodles and sauce with them. A determined child could remove them one by one, but the lunch bell usually favored surrender. The meal also changed as it sat. Early servings might hold their shape, while later portions softened and settled into the compartment. By then, the topping had become less a crust than a historical record of something once crisp. Fish sticks and tuna noodle casserole represented two approaches to the same cafeteria problem. One made fish familiar by breading it, shaping it, and serving it beside potatoes. The other folded it into noodles and cream sauce until every ingredient shared the same texture and temperature. Both were economical, practical, and capable of feeding a large school, but they produced very different memories. Fish sticks could be dipped, counted, stacked, or placed on bread. Tuna casserole demanded acceptance of the entire arrangement. One meal allowed each component to remain visible. The other believed strongly in cooperation. For some students, Friday fish meant crisp breading and tartar sauce. For others, it meant a pale scoop with peas and a roll kept safely at the edge of the tray. Once those pans were cleared, the cafeteria returned to foods that required even less explanation. Hot dogs rested in steamed buns, baked beans filled the side compartment, and in other regions a bowl of ham and beans waited beside a square of cornbread. The hot dog rested in a soft bun that had usually spent enough time beneath a cover to become warm, flexible, and slightly damp around the edges. In many 1970s cafeterias, it was one of the simplest meals on the calendar, immediately recognizable and unlikely to require an explanation from the adults behind the serving line. Mustard ketchup or relish might come in packets, small cups or bottles, supervised with varying degrees of seriousness. Beside the bun sat baked beans potato chips, mashed potatoes, coleslaw, corn, or canned fruit depending on the district and whatever combination completed the day's menu. The hot dog itself could be grilled, baked, boiled, or heated in large pans, but once it reached the tray, the method mattered less than the condition of the bun. A bun that stayed intact allowed the meal to be lifted with one hand. A bun softened too far divided at the bottom and released the hot dog without warning. Children learned to inspect the bread before adding ketchup. This was not etiquette, it was structural engineering. The cafeteria hot dog benefited from familiarity. Children had already met it at family cookouts, baseball games, neighborhood gatherings, lunch counters, and kitchen tables. It contained no hidden peas, no cream sauce, and no unfamiliar name printed on the monthly menu. Even students who approached casseroles with suspicion generally understood the arrangement. The main disagreement concerned toppings. Some children drew one careful line of mustard from end to end. Others covered the entire surface with ketchup until lifting the bun became dangerous. Relish introduced chopped green pieces that seemed unnecessary to younger diners and essential to certain adults. Packets created another small struggle. A corner had to be torn open without squeezing the contents onto a sleeve tray or nearby classmate. Once opened, a packet often released either almost nothing or far more than expected. The cafeteria supplied napkins, but rarely in numbers equal to the ambitions of the condiment. By the time the meal was finished, the tray might hold a bare bun corner, a smear of ketchup, several uneaten beans, and a milk carton positioned upright, as proof that at least one object had remained under control. Baked beans were a natural companion because they were economical, easy to heat in large quantities, and familiar across many regions. Their sauce could be sweet, smoky tomato-based, or flavoured with small pieces of pork depending on the recipe and ingredients available. A measured scoop filled one compartment where the beans immediately began testing the tray's borders. If the tray tilted, sauce moved toward the bun. Some children welcomed this and used the bread to collect it. Others treated the compartment divisions as sacred walls, and became disappointed when the cafeteria's design failed to enforce them. Beans also created a predictable debate about whether they belonged on the hot dog. A student could spoon several across the top and create a cafeteria version of a chili dog, although the result became nearly impossible to lift. Potato chips, when served, stayed safely dry until a neighbouring condiment reached them. Corn and fruit offered colour but little excitement. Still, the tray looked complete, and the hot dog provided the kind of main item that could be counted, quickly served rapidly, and understood by a lunchroom full of impatient children. Behind the counter, simplicity remained relative. Hot dogs still had to be stored, safely heated, thoroughly counted, transferred to pans matched with buns, and kept warm without allowing the bread to collapse. Cafeteria workers had to judge how many students would buy lunch, how many servings each pan contained, and how quickly the line would move. A meal built from individual portions reduced some uncertainty. One child received one hot dog, which was easier to control than a ladle of stew or a casserole scoop that changed shape from tray to tray. Yet every economical meal carried pressure. If demand was higher than expected, the final lunch period could not be served a speech about efficient purchasing. The food had to be there. The workers behind the line understood that children noticed shortages immediately, especially when the missing item was familiar. Few students protested publicly over the absence of cooked cabbage. A missing hot dog attracted a different level of attention. In other regions, especially in parts of the South Midwest and Appalachia, a bowl or tray compartment of ham and beans offered a very different expression of cafeteria economy. The meal might be called ham and beans, soup beans, navy beans, pinto beans, or bean soup, depending on local custom and the type of bean used. Small pieces of ham, hock flavour, or bits of pork seasoned a large pot, while onions and simple seasonings gave depth to ingredients that could feed many people at modest cost. The beans were soft, warm, and substantial, surrounded by broth that ranged from thin and pale to thick enough to cling to the spoon. This was not a national school lunch standard remembered equally everywhere. It was a regional meal, one that could feel completely ordinary to children raised with beans on the family table, and unexpectedly old-fashioned to students elsewhere. In communities where the dish belonged to local food traditions, it carried the taste of home into the cafeteria more directly than a hamburger ever could. Cornbread completed the meal. A square or wedge rested beside the beans, yellow or pale, crumbly or firm, slightly sweet in some schools, and decidedly unsweetened in others. Like the beans, cornbread invited family comparison. One child expected a crisp edge from an iron skillet. Another knew a softer version baked in a pan. Some families added sugar, while others considered that choice evidence of a serious regional misunderstanding. The cafeteria could not settle the argument. but it could provide bread sturdy enough to dip into the broth. Students crumbled it over the beans, soaked one corner at a time, or ate it first, and discovered too late that the bowl still contained liquid. Raw onions, greens, cabbage, fruit, or a vegetable might accompany the meal, although side dishes varied widely. The combination was nutritionally practical and deeply tied to the history of families who had long relied on dried beans, cornmeal, and small amounts of meat to create filling meals. It represented thrift but not emptiness. The pot required seasoning time and knowledge of how to make simple ingredients taste complete. Hot dogs with baked beans and ham and beans with cornbread stood at opposite ends of the same lunchroom calculation. One reflected convenience individual portions and the growing influence of snack bars and fast food. The other carried older regional habits into a large institutional kitchen, using a kettle patient cooking and ingredients that had stretched household budgets for generations. Both could feed a school efficiently. Both depended on bread to make the tray feel generous. And both demonstrated that inexpensive food could hold powerful memories even when children did not recognize the budgeting decisions behind it. A student remembered the torn bun, the mustard packet, the cornbread crumbs, or the last spoonful of bean broth. The adults remembered quantities, delivery schedules, and the need to keep every child fed through the final lunch period. Soon the cafeteria would move from simple economy toward imitation. Hamburgers and corn dogs would appear with potato pieces and ketchup, promising the excitement of a fast food counter, while remaining unmistakably under the control of the school kitchen. The hamburger patty waited inside a soft bun, often hidden beneath the top half, until a child lifted it to see what the cafeteria had provided. In many 1970s, school's hamburger day carried the promise of fast food, without the paper wrapper glowing menu board or freedom to order anything differently. The patty might be baked or heated in large pans, then placed on a bun that softened while waiting beneath foil or a metal cover. A slice of processed cheese turned it into a cheeseburger in some districts, melting neatly across the meat, or remaining square enough to reveal every corner. Lettuce, tomato, and onion were possible, especially in cafeterias offering more choice, but many trays presented the basic arrangement bun patty, perhaps cheese, potatoes, fruit or vegetables and milk. Ketchup and mustard provided the customization that the kitchen could not. From several feet away, the meal resembled something from a restaurant. At the table, the steamed bread and carefully counted patty reminded everyone that the school remained firmly in charge. Children approached the burger with a confidence rarely granted to casseroles. They already knew how to hold it where the ketchup belonged and which ingredients could be removed without damaging the meal. The first inspection concerned the bun. If it was dry enough, the burger could be lifted normally. If it had absorbed too much steam, both hands were required, and the lower half might remain attached to the tray. The second inspection concerned cheese. A properly warmed slice softened around the patty and gave the lunch a small sense of luxury. A cooler slice remained bright square and almost independent of the meat beneath it. Students folded the corners inward, removed it entirely, or accepted that cafeteria cheese followed its own schedule. Condiment packets added risk. Ketchup might emerge in a careful line or launch across the bun, with enough force to reach the potatoes. Mustard usually required less quantity but greater judgment. Once assembled, the burger became one of the few cafeteria entrees that children could alter visibly and immediately. Personal choice had entered the lunchroom, although it came in packets small enough to lose under a napkin. The potatoes beside the burger revealed how closely cafeterias were watching the foods children enjoyed outside school. Some trays held French fries, although keeping fries crisp through several lunch periods was difficult. Others offered round potato slices, wedges, mashed potatoes, or small formed pieces that could be baked from frozen and served with a scoop or tongs. These potato bites were easy to count, familiar to children, and useful for collecting extra ketchup. Their crispness depended on timing. Fresh from the oven, they could be browned outside and soft within. After waiting beneath a lid, they became warmer, paler, and more flexible. Children still ate them. A potato carrying ketchup required very little persuasion, even when it no longer produced a crunch. The side dish also made the tray resemble a fast food meal more convincingly, especially when paired with a cheeseburger. Yet the remaining compartment still belonged to the school system. Green beans, canned peaches, applesauce, or corn could sit beside the burger, creating a combination no restaurant advertisement would have placed in the foreground. For cafeteria workers, hamburgers provided individual portions but demanded careful coordination. Patties had to be stored, heated, counted, and kept at the proper temperature. Buns had to be opened and matched with the meat without drying out or becoming too damp. Cheese, when included, needed enough heat to soften without slowing the serving line. Potatoes occupied valuable oven space, and condiments had to be supplied in quantities that disappeared faster on popular menu days. Demand could rise sharply because children who normally carried lunchboxes might choose to buy the cafeteria meal when hamburgers appeared on the calendar. A kitchen therefore had to prepare for enthusiasm without creating excessive leftovers. The students saw a familiar sandwich. The staff saw hundreds of components that needed to arrive together within a short window. Restaurant-style food did not remove cafeteria labor. It simply divided the work into more pieces and gave every child an opportunity to ask why someone else had received a better-looking bun. The corn dog pushed the cafeteria's fast food ambition even further. A hot dog enclosed in a sweet or lightly seasoned cornmeal coating, usually served on a wooden stick, looked less like a traditional school entree and more like something from a fairground or snack stand. Its shape made it instantly appealing. There was no bun to collapse, no filling to escape, and no fork required, unless school rules insisted upon one. A student could hold the stick, dip the breaded surface into ketchup or mustard, and eat the meal in an orderly progression from one end to the other. The coating could be golden and firm when freshly heated or soft around the base after resting in a pan. Some children ate the outer layer first, carefully exposing the hot dog inside. Others bit through both together, which was clearly the intended method and therefore less interesting. The wooden stick created its own rules. It could not be waved, drummed on the table, or used to investigate another compartment, although the existence of these rules suggests that all three possibilities had occurred. Potato tots or similar small-formed potato pieces often appeared beside the corn dog, completing a tray built around foods children could pick up with their fingers. The potatoes emerged from the oven in rows, crisp at the edges, when timing was kind and easy to dip into whatever condiment remained. Corn beans, coleslaw, fruit, or a simple salad might complete the meal. The combination was practical for the kitchen, because the main items could be stored frozen, arranged on sheet pans, baked in quantity and portioned rapidly. It also reflected a broader move toward foods that resembled commercial snacks and restaurant meals. By the 1970s, children were increasingly familiar with drive-ins, fast food counters, frozen convenience products, and advertising aimed directly at young appetites. School cafeterias did not simply copy those foods, and many continued serving older stews, gravies, casseroles, and regional dishes. But burgers and corn dogs showed that the lunchroom was learning a new language, one spoken through bun sticks, packets, and foods designed to be held. The imitation was never complete, which may be why the memories lasted. A cafeteria hamburger could resemble a restaurant burger while tasting entirely like school. A corn dog could suggest the county fair while arriving beside canned fruit and a half pint of milk. These meals offered children a little independence because toppings could be chosen, cheese could be removed, and potatoes could be eaten before vegetables without changing the main dish. At the same time, every portion remained measured, every tray followed the line, and every student ate beneath the same clock. The cafeteria's fast food ambition was therefore less about freedom than familiarity. It offered shapes and flavors children recognized while preserving the budget nutrition rules and serving system of a public institution. Once the ketchup packets were emptied and the wooden sticks collected, the lunchroom turned back toward an older combination. Buttered bread met melted cheese. Tomato soup filled a bowl and macaroni waited beneath the sauce, whose color could brighten an otherwise gray school day. The grilled cheese sandwich usually reached the tray as 2 triangles or 1 square, its bread browned in patches and pressed around a layer of processed cheese that had melted just enough to hold everything together. Beside it sat a bowl or deep compartment of tomato soup, bright red-orange beneath the cafeteria lights, and smooth enough that no vegetable could be identified individually. In many 1970s schools, the combination appeared on cold or rainy days, when damp coats hung near classroom doors and the cafeteria windows fogged lightly above the radiators. The sandwich looked simple, but its condition depended entirely on timing. Fresh from the griddle or oven, the outside could remain crisp and the cheese soft. After waiting beneath foil or inside a warming pan, the bread absorbed steam and became flexible around the edges. Children judged the meal by whether the sandwich still produced a faint crunch when bitten. If it did, the lunch felt successful. If it folded without resistance, the tomato soup became less a dipping sauce than a place where the sandwich could quietly complete its transformation. Dipping was the central ritual. Some students lowered one corner carefully into the soup, allowing the bread to absorb just enough liquid before lifting it back toward the mouth. Others submerged an entire triangle and discovered that wet bread possessed a very short working life. A spoon could rescue the remains, but only after the student accepted that the meal had become something else. Crackers provided another option. Small packets were opened, the crackers crushed into the bowl, and the soup thickened until it could support the spoon. A few children spread crackers across the surface and watched them soften one by one. The sandwich itself invited inspection. The cheese might stretch in a thin strand between 2 halves, remain concentrated in the center, or cling more strongly to one slice of bread than the other. Margarine or butter gave the outside its browned surface, and the smell could fill the serving area, even when the soup was still hidden beneath a metal lid. The meal required no knife-little explanation, and almost no confidence in unfamiliar ingredients. It was bread, cheese, and tomato arranged so that every child could decide how much cooperation the 3 should be allowed. For the cafeteria kitchen, however, grilled cheese was not nearly as effortless as it looked. Hundreds of sandwiches had to be assembled, spread, cooked, transferred, and held without burning the bread or allowing the cheese to cool into a firm square. Some kitchens used griddles, while others arranged sandwiches on sheet pans and baked them in quantity. Either method demanded coordination. A sandwich cooked too early softened before lunch began. One cooked too late delayed the serving line. Tomato soup could be prepared in large kettles where it needed to remain smooth, hot, and pourable through several lunch periods. The meal was economical, but it also depended on labor that children rarely saw. Someone opened loaves, separated cheese slices, spread bread, turned trays, filled bowls, and washed pans coated with melted edges. The simplicity belonged mainly to the person eating it. Even then, the soup created risks. A tray tilted during the walk to the table could send a red wave toward the fruit compartment, and the thin paper napkin provided by the cafeteria was not designed for major tomato events. Macaroni and cheese offered another yellow center to the tray, but it arrived with greater weight and less need for dipping. Elbow macaroni sat beneath a cheese sauce that ranged from pale cream to bright orange, depending on the ingredients and recipe. Some versions were baked in large pans and cut into soft squares. Others were stirred in kettles and served with a rounded scoop. The macaroni could remain separate and glossy, or it could settle into a dense portion that held the shape of the utensil long after reaching the tray. Breadcrumbs appeared on top in some cafeterias, although their crispness often faded beneath the steam table lid. In other schools, the surface carried only a thin layer of darker cheese. The dish might be served as the main entree on a meatless menu day, or as a substantial side beside another item. When it stood alone, breadfruit, vegetables, and milk helped complete the lunch. Children generally recognized it immediately, but recognition did not guarantee agreement. Home versions, boxed versions, restaurant versions, and cafeteria versions had already taught them that macaroni and cheese could share a name while behaving like several unrelated foods. In parts of the country, stewed tomatoes appeared beside the macaroni, creating a combination remembered with affection by some students and complete disbelief by others. The tomatoes were soft, warm, slightly sweet or tangy, and filled with juice that moved easily across the tray. Some cafeterias placed them in a separate compartment. Others spooned them directly beside or over the macaroni, allowing red tomato liquid to enter the cheese sauce. The pairing had older roots in household cooking, where acidity from tomatoes balanced the richness of cheese and turned simple pantry ingredients into a filling meal. For children accustomed to the combination at home, it felt ordinary. For those who believed macaroni and cheese should remain untouched by anything red, the tray presented an immediate border dispute. A careful student could eat from the far side of the macaroni and preserve part of it. A less cautious movement sent tomato juice beneath the entire serving. Peas, green beans, or canned fruit might appear instead in other districts, reinforcing the larger truth of school lunches. The entree could travel nationally, but its companions often revealed exactly where the school stood on the map. Macaroni and cheese also demonstrated how institutional food changed while it waited. Cheese sauce thickened under heat. Elbows softened and absorbed moisture. A portion served during the first lunch period might be creamy enough to spread, while the final group received a firmer scoop with browned edges from the pan. Cafeteria workers stirred when possible, added liquid when recipes allowed, and tried to keep every serving reasonably consistent. Yet children remembered the variations as part of the dish. Some recall a smooth sauce that coated every noodle. Others remember a baked square that could almost be lifted whole. The bread beside it helped with any remaining sauce, while the milk carton supplied more dairy to a lunch that had already made its position clear. Grilled cheese with tomato soup and macaroni with stewed tomatoes were both built from inexpensive familiar ingredients, but they carried different moods. One invited dipping, handling, and small experiments. The other sat heavily in the tray, warm and dependable, asking only whether the tomatoes would be permitted to cross the line. Soon, however, the cafeteria would move beyond soup and cheese towards something louder. Brittle taco shells, seasoned ground beef, shredded lettuce, and soft burritos would bring a new set of flavors to school menus, especially in districts where those foods had long been part of the local table. The taco shell usually revealed its weakness before the tray reached the table. A hard yellow shell sat upright beneath seasoned ground beef, shredded lettuce, and grated cheese, looking tidy for the brief moment between serving and movement. Then the tray tilted, the shell cracked along the bottom, and part of the filling slipped into the compartment where corn beans, rice, or fruit had been placed. In some 1970s school districts, especially in the West and Southwest, tacos were already familiar lunchroom food. In others, they appeared later or less frequently presented as something new beside the older rotation of meatloaf stew and gravy. The cafeteria version was not one universal recipe. and it should not be mistaken for the many Mexican-American taco traditions found in homes and local restaurants. This was an institutional adaptation built for large kitchens, ground beef, seasoned mildly enough for a wide range of children, shells that could be counted quickly, lettuce that added colour and cheese scattered across the top before the line moved forward. It promised excitement. It also required immediate structural attention. Children developed methods for keeping the taco together. Some held it firmly with both hands, fingers placed near the centre to support the shell. Others leaned over the tray and took the first bite quickly, hoping to control the crack before it travelled from one end to the other. The least fortunate lifted the taco by its upper edges and watched the bottom fall away, leaving the filling in a neat pile beneath an empty shell. At that point, the fork became necessary and the meal changed from taco day into seasoned beef salad with broken corn pieces. Lettuce escaped first because it had been piled loosely and offered no resistance to movement. Cheese followed, sticking to the meat when warm and scattering across the tray when cool. Tomato pieces might appear in some schools while others avoided them entirely. Taco sauce could be spooned on, served in packets or absent, leaving ketchup to perform a job it had not formally requested. Students who knew stronger, fresher, or more carefully prepared tacos at home often found the cafeteria seasoning mild. Others considered even that level of spice an important event. Behind the serving line, tacos created more work than their simple ingredients suggested. Ground beef had to be browned, drained, seasoned, and kept warm without drying out. Lettuce had to be washed, chilled, shredded, and protected from the heat rising from nearby pans. Cheese had to be portioned, shells opened and counted, and every tray assembled quickly enough to prevent the line from slowing. A shell filled too early could soften where the meat touched it. One filled too late might leave the student waiting while the next 100 children watched. Some kitchens solved the problem by serving the components separately, allowing students to assemble their own tacos at the table. That arrangement provided more control, but also created more opportunities for lettuce to reach the floor. Other cafeterias placed one or two finished tacos directly onto the tray and trusted the children to manage the rest. The lunch might include refried beans, corn, a simple salad fruit, or a serving of rice described on many menus as Spanish rice. Names and recipes varied, and the sides often revealed whether the meal had grown from local food traditions or had been introduced through a standardized district menu. The rice usually arrived in an orange-red scoop coloured by tomato and mixed with onions, peppers, or small vegetable pieces depending on the kitchen. It was soft enough to hold the shape of the portion utensil for a few moments before spreading across the compartment. Some children placed loose taco filling on top of it and created a second meal after the shell broke. Others ignored it in favour of the beans, which could be smooth, thick, and difficult to separate from the tray once cooled. Refried beans brought another familiar food into certain regional cafeterias, but in districts where students had little experience with them, the texture caused hesitation. A warm roll of beans beside a crisp taco shell seemed unusual to children accustomed to potatoes with nearly every entree. Yet the combination made practical sense. Beans and rice were filling, economical, and capable of making a modest serving of meat feel complete. They also showed that school menus were changing, although not at the same speed everywhere. A lunch common in a Texas, Arizona, California, or New Mexico district might still seem adventurous on a menu farther north or east. The bean and cheese burrito solved the shell problem by replacing brittle corn with a soft flour tortilla. It arrived folded around beans, cheese, seasoned meat, or some combination of the three, with the ends tucked in more successfully on some days than others. A well-sealed burrito could be lifted easily and eaten without a fork. A loosely folded one released filling from the bottom as soon as pressure was applied to the top. Some school burritos were assembled in the kitchen, while others may have arrived as prepared institutional products that could be heated in large quantities. The tortilla softened during warming and could become chewy around the edges, but it remained more dependable than the taco shell. Cheese melted into the beans, creating a filling that stayed hot longer than its appearance suggested. Children learned to take the first bite carefully. The outside might feel merely warm, while the center retained enough heat to end conversation for several seconds. Taco sauce, rice, corn salad, or fruit completed the tray, and the familiar milk carton remained present beside flavors it had not been designed to accompany. Burritos also changed the trading possibilities. Unlike tuna casserole or chili, they could move from one tray to another without losing their shape. A student who disliked beans might trade the entire entree for dessert potatoes from another meal or a second carton of milk. Someone who enjoyed them could acquire an extra lunch with relatively little negotiation, especially if the tortilla had not split. The burrito's enclosed form hid the filling, which created both confidence and uncertainty. A child knew it contained beans and cheese because the menu said so, but the exact proportions remained unknown until the first bite. Some were mostly beans, others offered a thin line of melted cheese. A few contained ground beef or sauce depending on the district. The cafeteria was experimenting with foods that could be prepared efficiently, while feeling different from older institutional meals. The burrito fit that goal perfectly. It was portable, portioned, recognizable in many communities, and adaptable to large-scale cooking. Yet it carried the same challenge as every school lunch borrowed from a living regional tradition. The cafeteria version could never represent the full range of foods families knew at home. Hardshell tacos and bean and cheese burritos marked an important shift in the 1970s lunchroom. They did not replace gravy casseroles or sandwiches, but they widened the menu and acknowledged tastes that had always varied across American communities. For some children, Taco Day was a welcome piece of home culture appearing at school. For others, it was the first time seasoned beef, shredded lettuce, beans and tortillas arrived together on a cafeteria tray. The memories depended on place. One student remembered a meal prepared by cooks who understood the local tradition. Another remembered a shell that shattered immediately and a packet of sauce that refused to open. Both memories belonged to the decade. Once the last broken shells were swept away and the rice pans were cleaned, the cafeteria continued searching for foods that felt familiar and new at the same time. Tomato sauce, cheese, and ground meat soon returned, this time piled onto a hamburger bun under the promising name of pizza burger. The pizza burger arrived on a hamburger bun, but everything above the bread suggested that the cafeteria had other ambitions. Tomato sauce, seasoned ground beef or sausage, and melted cheese covered the open face, creating a meal that borrowed its name from pizza while preserving the speed and shape of a sandwich. In some schools, the bun was served open with the topping exposed beneath browned cheese. In others, a second bun half rested on top, turning the entire arrangement into a saucy sandwich that required both hands and a willingness to accept stains. The exact recipe varied so widely that former students can describe several different lunches under the same name. One remembers a round meat patty covered with pizza sauce and cheese. Another remembers crumbled meat spooned directly onto the bread. A third recalls something closer to a small sloppy Joe wearing mozzarella. The common idea was simple. Take ingredients children already liked, place them on familiar bread and produce something new enough to make the monthly menu sound exciting. The bun made the meal practical, but it also created its greatest weakness. Pizza dough was built to support sauce and cheese. A hamburger bun had been assigned that responsibility without receiving any additional training. When the topping was thick and the bread had been lightly toasted, the pizza burger could be lifted and eaten with surprising order. When the sauce soaked into the lower half, the bun softened until the fork became essential. Children learned to inspect the edges before attempting the first bite. A dry rim suggested structural hope. A dark red stain spreading underneath meant the sandwich had already begun separating from itself. Cheese could hold the topping together, stretching from bun to mouth in long threads that looked impressive until they landed on a chin or shirt. If the meal was served, open-faced students cut it into sections with the side of a fork or folded the bread inward, inventing a crude calzone without asking permission. No single method worked every time. The pizza burger rewarded confidence but punished overconfidence immediately. Potato rounds, corn, green bean salad, applesauce or canned fruit might occupy the remaining compartments. The sides reminded students that this was still a school lunch, rather than an order placed at a pizza counter. Corn was particularly likely to join the sauce after the tray tilted, and some children simply placed it on top, repeating the experiment already familiar from rectangular pizza day. Salad created a sharper contrast. Cool shredded lettuce and a small amount of dressing sat beside a hot sandwich that could release cheese and tomato sauce without warning. Applesauce offered a safer boundary, although its compartment was not always deep enough to prevent contact. Ketchup was unnecessary, but occasionally used anyway because children did not always allow a meal's existing tomato content to limit their decisions. The milk carton completed the combination cold and slightly damp against the tray. Pizza sauce. Processed cheese, canned fruit and milk may not have been designed as a unified flavor experience, but the cafeteria had never promised harmony. It promised lunch. Behind the serving counter, the pizza burger offered school kitchens a way to create variety without abandoning familiar equipment or ingredients. Ground meat could be browned in quantity sauce heated in large pans buns, arranged across sheet trays and cheese added before baking or holding. The meal could use products already present in the cafeteria's purchasing system, while changing their appearance enough to earn a new name on the menu. Yet assembly required speed. Too much sauce made the bread collapse. Too little left the topping dry. Cheese needed enough heat to melt, but not so much time that it formed a firm skin before serving. Workers had to prepare hundreds of portions that looked reasonably similar, even though the first tray from a pan might receive more meat and the final one more sauce. If the buns were toasted, oven space became more complicated. If they were not, softness became inevitable. The pizza burger may have sounded like an easy shortcut, but large-scale convenience always arrived carrying several pans that someone still had to wash. Its popularity where it appeared came partly from the name. Pizza had already become one of the most anticipated words on a school menu, while burger suggested another familiar favorite. Combining them created an almost unfair level of expectation. Children approaching the line imagined the best qualities of both foods. The actual tray delivered a cafeteria interpretation, shaped by budget timing equipment and the need to serve several lunch periods. Some students loved it precisely because it was saucy, cheesy, and easy to understand. Others considered it a disappointing substitute for rectangular pizza. A child expecting a hamburger patty might be surprised by loose meat. Another expecting pizza crust might object to the soft bun. The meal existed in the uncertain territory between categories which gave it both charm and risk. It was not entirely a pizza and not entirely a burger. It was what happened when the cafeteria attempted to make Wednesday feel different without purchasing an entirely different kitchen. The pizza burger also reflected the broader search for novelty that moved through many 1970s school menus. Cafeterias still depended on established meals such as meatloaf stew beans and casseroles, but children were increasingly familiar with foods promoted by restaurants, frozen food packages, television advertising, and expanding supermarket aisles. A menu needed to feel recognizable, while occasionally offering something that sounded modern. Hybrid food solved that problem. A bun could carry barbecue one week, seasoned beef the next, and pizza toppings after that. The same ground meat, cheese, tomato products, and bread could appear under several names, each promising a different experience. This was careful economy disguised as invention, and the disguise often worked. Students discussed the pizza burger because it did not look exactly like dinner at home or lunch from a restaurant. It belonged specifically to the cafeteria, where familiar ingredients were regularly asked to become something more ambitious. Years later, former students may disagree about what a pizza burger actually was, and all of them may be describing their own schools accurately. That uncertainty is part of the memory. School menus were local recipes changed, and cafeteria workers adapted meals to available supplies and the tastes of their communities. One version may have been crisp at the edges and heavy with cheese. Another may have required a spoon by the final bite. The name survived more clearly than the recipe because the name captured the cafeteria's optimism. Pizza plus burger sounded impossible to refuse. Once the buns had softened, the cheese had cooled, and the last red-stained trays entered the dish room, the lunchroom moved toward another meal built around a crust. Individual chicken pot pies or large pan portions arrived steaming beneath pastry, promising a neat package that the steam table would soon make considerably less neat. The chicken pot pie arrived looking like a complete meal sealed beneath a pale golden roof. In some 1970s cafeterias, each student received a small individual pie in a shallow foil pan. In others, the kitchen baked a larger version and served it in square or irregular portions with pastry resting over cream chicken and vegetables. The first sight created optimism. A crust suggested crispness, warmth, and something carefully enclosed. Then the pie waited beneath a cover. Steam rose from the filling, and the bottom of that crust began surrendering. By the time the tray reached the table, the top might still be flaky around the edges, while the center had softened into the gravy below. Inside were pieces of chicken peas, carrots, potatoes, celery, or onions, suspended in a pale sauce that stayed hotter than the outside gave any warning. Fruit, green beans, corn, or a small salad filled the remaining compartments. The meal looked orderly, but the first touch of a fork usually proved that the crust and filling had already begun negotiating their separation. Opening the pie required patience. A student could press the fork through the center and release a cloud of steam, or begin at the edge where the pastry was firmer and easier to lift. Children who ignored the heat often took one confident bite and then remained silent while the filling reminded them that gravy holds temperature remarkably well. The crust created different schools of thought. Some students ate the crisp outer rim first, protecting the best texture before the sauce reached it. Others broke the entire top into pieces and stirred them into the filling, turning pastry, chicken, vegetables, and gravy into a single soft mixture. A careful child might lift the crust like a lid and inspect the contents beneath it. This inspection could reveal several promising pieces of chicken or an impressive population of peas. Since the filling was concealed, every pie carried a small element of chance. The menu promised chicken pot pie. The spoon sometimes reported that the vegetables had organized a stronger presence. The individual foil pan made the meal especially memorable. It was light, ridged around the edge, and hot enough to demand respect when first placed on the tray. The fork scraped against the bottom with a thin metallic sound different from the usual noise of utensils on plastic or divided trays. Press too firmly and the foil bent. Lift one side carelessly, and the remaining gravy moved toward the lowest point. Some schools removed the pie from its container before serving, while others left it inside, allowing the student to eat directly from the little pan. The container made lunch feel more like a frozen supper, or a meal prepared specifically for one person, even though dozens of identical pies had entered the oven together. It also created extra waste, and handling one reason large pan versions could be more practical. No single form belonged to every school. The local kitchen budget equipment supplier, a number of students all shaped whether pot pie arrived as a private round pie, a square cut from a larger pan, or cream chicken beneath a biscuit-like topping. For cafeteria workers, the crust was only one part of a complicated timing problem. The filling needed to be thoroughly heated, the pastry had to bake without burning, and the finished pies had to remain warm through several lunch periods. A crust was at its best soon after leaving the oven, but a school lunch line did not serve every child at once. The first group might receive pastry with a little lift and colour. Later students encountered a softer top that had absorbed more steam. Large pan pot pies could be easier to produce in quantity, but cutting and lifting equal portions without losing filling demanded care. Individual pies simplified counting while requiring more oven space and handling. Either way, cooks had to coordinate vegetables, fruit, milk, and hundreds of trays, while making certain the chicken mixture lasted until the final group. The student saw a neat pastry shell. Behind it stood pans, ladles, ovens, temperature checks, and the familiar cafeteria arithmetic of how many portions remained. Canned fruit often appeared beside the pot pie because it offered a cool, sweet contrast to the hot cream sauce. Peaches, pears, applesauce, pineapple, or fruit cocktail could be stored in quantity and portioned with a scoop. The syrup or juice collected at the bottom of the compartment where it remained peaceful until the tray tilted. If it crossed into the pot pie, sweet fruit liquid met savoury gravy in a combination almost no recipe had planned. Children therefore carried the tray carefully, keeping the pie level and the fruit safely contained. Fruit cocktail brought its own small competition. The pale cubes of pear and peach were dependable, but a red cherry or bright piece of fruit could become the most desirable object on the tray. Some children ate the fruit first to cool the mouth after opening the pie. Others saved it as dessert, guarding it from gravy with the discipline of an engineer. The pot pie itself was difficult to trade once opened. Like casseroles and stew, it belonged to the child who had broken the crust. A roll or fruit cup could move across the table. An opened foil pan full of hot filling was committed. Chicken pot pie belonged to a category of cafeteria meals that promised home-style comfort, while depending heavily on institutional efficiency. It enclosed modest pieces of chicken and vegetables in sauce used pastry or bread to make the serving feel generous, and placed a complete-looking entree in front of each child. At home, a pot pie might be assembled from leftover roast chicken, homemade pastry, or a family recipe. At school, it had to tolerate storage, baking schedules, portioning, and time beneath a warming cover. The crust rarely remained as crisp as anyone hoped, but that softness became part of the memory. Former students recall the metal pan, the escaping steam, the first dangerously hot bite, and the search for chicken beneath the peas. Once the final crusts had been broken and the foil pans cleared away, the cafeteria returned to meals without pastry or concealment. Ground beef entered brown gravy, mashed potatoes waited beneath the ladle, and Swiss steak brought another older family supper into the authority of the steam table. The mashed potatoes arrived first, a pale, rounded mound placed in the centre of the tray with a portion scoop, and pressed lightly enough to leave its curved shape behind. Then came hamburger gravy, a brown mixture of ground beef, onions, broth, and thickened sauce poured directly over the top. In many 1970s cafeterias this meal appeared under names such as hamburger gravy, beef gravy, ground beef gravy, or simply meat and gravy over potatoes. The exact name depended on the district, but the tray was easy to recognize. Small pieces of beef floated through a glossy sauce that settled into the potato ridges, filled the crater left by the scoop and spread outward toward the vegetables. Green beans, peas, corn, carrots, bread, and canned fruit completed the lunch. It was not visually dramatic. Everything seemed to come from the beige and brown end of the cafeteria colour chart. Yet the meal offered warmth, weight, and the reassuring message that no child would be expected to face the afternoon on lettuce alone. Hamburger gravy made practical use of ground beef because the meat did not need to appear as one complete patty for each student. Cafeteria workers could brown large quantities in a kettle or deep pan, stir in onions and seasoning, add liquid, and thicken the mixture into a sauce that carried flavour across hundreds of servings. A comparatively modest quantity of beef could look generous once distributed through gravy and placed over potatoes. The meal stretched the budget quietly, without leaving an empty main compartment or requiring an explanation about rising food costs. Potatoes did much of the work. They supplied substance, absorbed the sauce, and gave the ladle a dependable surface on which to land. Whether the potatoes were prepared from fresh potatoes, dehydrated products, or another institutional method varied by kitchen labour equipment and purchasing decisions. Students rarely knew the process. They judged the result by whether the potatoes were smooth, stiff, watery, or capable of holding gravy without collapsing. A firm scoop suggested order. A softer scoop turned the tray into a landscape problem. Children developed their own approaches to hamburger gravy. Some mixed the meat and potatoes, immediately turning both into a uniform brown and white mash. Others ate carefully from one side, preserving a portion of plain potatoes in case the gravy proved too peppery, salty, or unfamiliar. A slice of bread or warm roll became essential equipment. It could push loose meat onto the fork, absorb sauce from the corners, or clean the tray after the potatoes were gone. Peas occasionally escaped into the gravy and became nearly impossible to separate. Corn disappeared even more easily, its yellow kernels blending into the sauce until discovered by accident. A child who disliked gravy faced a difficult lunch because removing it from the potatoes was not an option the cafeteria had provided. Trading was equally complicated. The meal could not travel across the table in one piece, and few classmates were willing to receive a spoonful of ground beef from another tray. Once the ladle had fallen, the assignment was permanent. The steam table changed the meal as each lunch period passed. Gravy thickened while it waited, potatoes dried slightly along the surface, and small pieces of beef settled toward the bottom of the pan. Cafeteria workers stirred the mixture so later, servings contained more than sauce, then refilled pans while watching the line and estimating how many students remained. Early portions could be loose enough to spread quickly across the tray. Later servings might sit heavily on the potatoes and require the fork to separate them. The work demanded more judgment than students could see. Too much gravy on early trays might leave too little for the final group. Too little made the potatoes appear dry and the meal ungenerous. The serving worker had to create something close to equality using a ladle, a moving line, and a pan whose contents changed with every scoop. Children noticed any difference immediately. A classmate with more visible meat had not merely received lunch, he had received evidence that the system was imperfect. Swiss steak appeared on another menu day carrying an older and more formal identity. Despite the name, the dish had nothing to do with Swiss cheese. In American home cooking, Swiss steak generally referred to beef that had been tenderized and slowly cooked with tomatoes, gravy, onions, or other seasonings until a tougher cut became easier to eat. School versions varied considerably. Some cafeterias served a piece of tenderized beef beneath tomato-based sauce. Others offered a formed or portioned beef product covered with brown gravy. The meat might be rectangular, oval, or irregular enough to suggest that it had once belonged to a larger cut. Mashed potatoes returned beside it, because they remained the most reliable companion for any sauce the kitchen could produce. Green beans, carrots, corn, or peas completed the tray while a roll waited close enough to absorb whatever the fork could not retrieve. Swiss steak looked more substantial than hamburger gravy, but it served a similar purpose, turning practical beef patient cooking and sauce into a complete institutional meal. The name gave Swiss steak a seriousness that hamburger gravy did not possess. A child reading the menu might imagine something exotic and then discover a slice of beef resting beneath familiar brown or red sauce. Families who prepared Swiss steak at home brought their own expectations. One version might contain tomatoes and onions, another relied on brown gravy. Some home cooks simmered it slowly until the meat could be cut with a fork, while others used a pressure cooker to shorten the work. The cafeteria had to reproduce tenderness on a larger schedule with pieces that could survive cooking, holding portioning and the walk to the table. A successful serving yielded beneath the fork and carried the flavour of the sauce. A less successful piece required careful cutting with a table knife that might not have been provided. Students then used the edge of the fork, pressing repeatedly until the meat separated or the potatoes became involved. School lunch frequently taught persistence through methods that were not listed in the curriculum. Mashed potatoes were the infrastructure beneath both meals. They were inexpensive, familiar filling, and capable of making gravy look like a plan rather than a liquid searching for somewhere to go. They connected institutional food with family suppers, restaurant plates, frozen dinners, church basements, and holiday tables. The potatoes also disguised the arithmetic behind the lunch. A smaller portion of meat could still feel substantial when placed over a generous scoop, supported by vegetables, breadfruit, and milk. This was not deception so much as practical meal building, the same kind of calculation families used at home when the grocery budget had to last until payday. The cafeteria simply performed it on a larger scale. Hundreds of children received the same pale mound, the same ladle of sauce, and nearly the same hope that their serving contained enough meat. Once the gravy pans were scraped clean and the potato scoops dropped into hot wash water, the next casserole brought a name that travelled poorly beyond its home territory. Pasta, ground beef, tomato sauce, and cheese entered the tray as Johnny Marzetti, a lunch familiar in parts of the Midwest and almost unknown everywhere else. The name arrived on the lunch calendar before the casserole reached the tray. Johnny Marzetti. Children in central Ohio and parts of the surrounding Midwest often understood exactly what those words promised. Students elsewhere might have stared at the menu wondering whether Johnny was a cook, a teacher, or someone who had made a serious mistake near the pasta. The dish itself was easier to recognize than its name. Elbow macaroni or another short pasta was mixed with ground beef tomato sauce, onions and melted cheese, then baked in large pans until the edges darkened and the center became soft and heavy. A square or rounded scoop landed in the main compartment beside green beans, corn salad, fruit, or a warm roll. It resembled cafeteria goulash baked spaghetti beef and macaroni, or several other regional casseroles. Yet in the communities that called it Johnny Marzetti, the name carried a particular authority. This was not merely pasta with meat sauce. It had been introduced properly. The casserole's precise origin has become surrounded by local legend. It has long been associated with Columbus, Ohio, and a popular story connects it to the Marzetti family's restaurant near the Ohio State campus. According to the familiar version, the inexpensive pasta and beef dish was named for a member of the family and spread through homes, potlucks, and institutional kitchens. The story is memorable, but its documentary foundation is uncertain, and even the company connected to the Marzetti name has acknowledged that firm evidence is lacking. What is much easier to establish is the dish's place in regional memory. Generations of central Ohio residents remember Johnny Marzetti at family suppers, church gatherings, neighborhood dinners, and school cafeterias. By the 1970s, the name could appear on a local lunch menu without explanation, While children only a few states away might know a nearly identical casserole as goulash beefaroni, American chop suey, or simply macaroni with meat sauce, the recipe crossed borders more easily than the name. In the cafeteria kitchen, Johnny Marzetti offered nearly everything a large food service operation needed. Ground beef could be browned in quantity. Tomato sauce and canned tomatoes could be stored on pantry shelves. Dried pasta was economical, predictable, and capable of stretching the meat through hundreds of portions. Cheese added richness and helped bind the mixture while giving the top a browned surface that made the pan look complete. Cafeteria workers could assemble several deep trays before lunch, bake them, and move each one to the steam table as the serving line required. The challenge came during portioning. A freshly baked casserole could be cut into recognizable squares, but heat and repeated scooping gradually loosened the arrangement. Early students might receive a firm corner piece with browned cheese along two edges. Later students often received a softer mound from the center, where pasta sauce, and beef had abandoned any interest in geometry. Both portions carried the same name, though the corner piece clearly enjoyed privileges. Texture determined whether the meal felt comforting or exhausting. The pasta had to remain soft enough for a fork but firm enough to survive baking and holding. The sauce needed sufficient moisture to prevent the casserole from drying, yet too much liquid turned the serving into tomato-coloured macaroni soup. Cheese could melt through the dish, form a layer across the top, or appear only in occasional strands depending on the recipe and budget. Some versions included mushrooms, peppers, celery, or additional seasonings. Others stayed close to the basic combination of beef, tomato pasta, and cheese. Children inspected the scoop for visible meat in the same way they studied beef stew for promising cubes. A serving heavy with pasta was still filling, but a few pieces of ground beef made the tray feel fairer. The bread beside it became useful for pushing stray elbows onto the fork and collecting sauce. Corn sometimes rolled directly into the casserole and disappeared so naturally that separating it seemed unnecessarily formal. The dish also demonstrated how cafeteria food could preserve local identity without announcing that it was doing so. National school meal structures shaped the tray. Purchasing systems influenced the ingredients, and institutional equipment encouraged recipes that could be baked or stirred in large quantities. Yet names remained stubbornly regional. A child in Columbus might grow up believing Johnny Marzetti was an ordinary American, lunch served everywhere. Years later, a conversation with someone from another state could reveal that the name meant absolutely nothing beyond Ohio and neighboring communities. The second person might then describe a childhood casserole made with macaroni, ground beef, tomatoes, and cheese. The two memories would meet in the middle, identical in nearly every respect except vocabulary. This was common in American home and school cooking. Recipes travelled through community cookbooks, newspaper columns, church kitchens, relatives, and cafeteria manuals, changing slightly at every stop. One town protected a distinctive name. Another reduced the same meal to a practical description, because lunch workers had little time for mythology. For children who knew Johnny Marzetti at home, the cafeteria serving entered a family competition it could never fully win. A parent's version might contain more cheese, stronger seasoning, a different pasta shape, or a crisp top taken directly from the oven. The school version had to wait beneath a metal lid and satisfy several hundred diners whose preferences contradicted one another. Still, the smell of tomato sauce, baked cheese, and warm pasta could make the lunchroom feel familiar. It was a substantial meal on a cold day, easy to eat, difficult to trade once served, and capable of carrying a student through the afternoon without requiring complicated utensils. The name made it memorable, but the ordinary ingredients made it last. Johnny Marzetti belonged to the large family of American casseroles that turned budget arithmetic into comfort food and gave regional communities something they assumed everyone else understood. Beyond that regional border, another unusual pairing waited on the lunch calendar. A bowl of vegetable soup would arrive beside a plain peanut butter sandwich, creating a combination that seemed completely natural in some school districts and almost impossible to explain in others. The vegetable soup arrived in a bowl or deep tray compartment filled with carrots, peas, green beans, corn potatoes, tomatoes, celery, and whatever other vegetables the district recipe had gathered into the kettle. The broth could be bright red from tomatoes, or pale and thin enough to reveal every ingredient beneath the surface. Beside it sat a peanut butter sandwich made from 2 slices of soft white bread, usually without jelly and sometimes cut into rectangles or triangles. To children in parts of the Midwest and South, especially in certain Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and neighboring school districts, the combination could feel completely ordinary. To students from other regions, it sounded like 2 unrelated lunches had been placed on the same tray by mistake. Yet the pairing followed a practical logic. Vegetable soup was warm, economical, and able to feed many children from one kettle. Peanut butter provided protein, calories, familiarity, and a sandwich that required no cooking once assembled. Together they created a filling meal from ingredients that could be stored, measured, and served with remarkable efficiency. The soup changed with every ladle. One child received several potatoes, a piece of tomato, and enough corn to make the bowl look generous. The next received more broth, 2 peas, and a carrot slice floating alone near the edge. Cafeteria workers stirred the kettle often, but vegetables settled at different rates, and portion equality remained an aspiration rather than a guarantee. The potatoes and carrots sank. Corn and peas moved wherever the ladle encouraged them. Green beans appeared in lengths that could be lifted with a spoon, only after several attempts. Some schools added small pieces of beef, pasta, barley, or beans, but many versions remained plainly vegetable soup, relying on bread and peanut butter to make the tray substantial. Crackers might appear beside the bowl, though their purpose became less urgent when a sandwich was already present. Children crumbled them into the broth anyway, watching the crisp squares soften and disappear. A roll would have been redundant, but school cafeterias had never been deeply troubled by the existence of extra bread. The peanut butter sandwich brought its own unmistakable texture. The bread was soft, the filling thick, and the first bite could cling to the roof of the mouth with enough determination to slow conversation. Without jelly, the sandwich was less sweet than the version many children packed from home. It also remained more stable. Jelly could soak through bread leak onto the tray, or interfere with the district's attempt to create a neat institutional lunch. Plain peanut butter stayed where it had been spread at least until the sandwich was dipped into the soup. Some children did exactly that, lowering one corner into the tomato broth and treating the pairing as naturally as grilled cheese with tomato soup. Others refused to let the 2 foods touch, eating the sandwich first and the soup afterward. A few opened the bread, inspected the peanut butter layer, and pressed the slices together again with unnecessary force. The sandwich required no fork, but the milk carton became essential. Peanut butter created thirst quickly, and a carton that refused to open could turn lunch into a test of patience. For the kitchen staff, the meal solved several problems at once. Soup could make use of canned, frozen, or fresh vegetables depending on the district season and purchasing system. Large kettles allowed cooks to prepare hundreds of servings, while the sandwich assembly could be organized across tables with bread-measured peanut butter and stacks of trays. Yet the simplicity concealed repetitive labor. Loaves had to be opened, slices separated, filling spread evenly, sandwiches closed, counted, cut, and protected from drying. The soup required chopping or opening containers, measuring liquid seasoning, heating, stirring and watching the vegetables soften without completely losing their shape. Peanut butter also demanded attention because allergies, ingredient rules, and school policies would later change how comfortably it could remain on menus. During the 1970s, however, many districts regarded it as a dependable low-cost staple. It stored well, children recognized it, and one sandwich could help turn a bowl of vegetables into a complete lunch without requiring an additional meat entree. What makes the combination especially valuable to memory is how strongly it maps the country. School lunch was national in purpose but local in practice. Federal meal structures influence what components appeared, yet districts still work through regional habits, local suppliers, community expectations, and recipes inherited from earlier generations of cafeteria workers. Vegetable soup with peanut butter might appear repeatedly in one county and never once in another. A former student could describe the meal with warmth, remembering cold winter days, soft bread, and the way the sandwich tasted after touching tomato broth. Another person of the same age might assume the story had been invented. Both reactions reveal how American childhood could feel universal from inside one school building, while remaining deeply regional beyond it. Children rarely knew that their lunch was unusual. The menu printed vegetable soup and peanut butter sandwich. The teacher counted raised hands, and the meal entered memory without requesting historical explanation. The pairing also carried the thrift of older household cooking. Soup stretched vegetables and small pantry ingredients through a large amount of warm liquid. Peanut butter turned bread into something more sustaining without requiring expensive meat or lengthy preparation. Families had used the same logic at home, especially during weeks when the grocery budget required meals that were plain but dependable. The cafeteria enlarged that arithmetic until it filled an entire dining room. There was no need to romanticize the economy behind it. A limited budget placed real pressure on cooks and administrators, and not every child greeted the meal with enthusiasm. Some students disliked cooked vegetables. Others found the plain sandwich dry, and children who had eaten peanut butter repeatedly at home might have hoped school lunch would offer something different. Yet simple food was not meaningless food. The warm bowl, the familiar bread, and the cold milk could provide comfort, especially for a child whose meal at school was the most reliable one of the day. The tray left behind a collection of modest details: orange broth staining the spoon softened crackers along the bowl's edge, a fingerprint pressed into white bread, and a small streak of peanut butter on the milk carton. Nothing about the meal competed with pizza day or the excitement of hamburgers. Its importance came from repetition and place. It belonged to specific schools, counties, and regions, becoming part of the local lunchroom language, just as Johnny Marzetti had in central Ohio. Years later, the unusual pairing could identify where someone grew up more clearly than an accent. Once the soup bowls were emptied and the sandwich crumbs brushed from the tables, the cafeteria map widened again. Large cans of crispy noodles appeared beside rice, celery, meat, and thick gravy preparing students for an Americanized chow mein that promised a cautious kind of lunchtime adventure. The chow mein appeared as a thick, glossy mixture spooned over rice, or placed beside it carrying pieces of meat, celery, onions, cabbage, bean sprouts, and other vegetables through a pale brown sauce. In some 1970s cafeterias, the meal was called chow mein, even when it bore only a distant resemblance to the many Chinese and Chinese-American dishes known by that name. School kitchens adapted foods to local ingredients, purchasing systems, equipment, and the cautious taste they expected from hundreds of children. The result could be mild, soft, and heavily thickened with chicken, pork, turkey, or ground meat depending on the district. A small pile of crispy noodles often waited beside the serving, either poured from a large institutional container or handed out in a packet. Those golden curls gave the tray its most memorable texture. Before touching the sauce, they snapped between the teeth. After several minutes beneath the gravy, they softened into something entirely different. Children quickly learned that crispy noodles had a limited period of crispness and should not be asked to wait politely. The first decision was whether to place the noodles on top of the chow mein or eat them separately. Students who wanted maximum crunch protected them at the edge of the tray, picking them up one at a time like snack food. Others scattered them over the sauce, immediately creating a brittle layer that lasted for perhaps 3 bites before absorbing moisture. A few mixed everything together, combining rice, vegetables, gravy, and noodles into a single mound that could be eaten efficiently with a fork. The noodles were often the easiest part of the meal to trade. They were dry, portable, and free from the uncertainty surrounding the vegetables beneath the sauce. A child who disliked chow mein might still finish every crispy noodle before attempting the entree. Another student might offer canned fruit or a roll in exchange for an extra handful. Unlike gravy or casserole, the noodles crossed the table cleanly. They possessed the rare cafeteria advantage of remaining recognizable from beginning to end, provided no one placed them too close to the sauce. The rice formed the meal's quiet foundation. It might arrive as a white scoop in one compartment ready to receive the chow mein or already buried beneath the ladle. A properly cooked serving separated easily beneath the fork. Rice held too long in a steam table could become dry at the surface, or dense enough to preserve the shape of the portion scoop. The sauce helped restore moisture, though it also made the grains difficult to keep inside the compartment. Children accustomed to rice at home often noticed immediately when the cafeteria version was too soft, too firm, or prepared in an unfamiliar way. Others approached it as a change from the usual potatoes, noodles, and bread. The thick gravy made the meal easier for inexperienced diners because it held meat and vegetables together. Celery remained visible, however pale green and curved enough to inspire inspection. Some pieces stayed slightly firm. Others softened during cooking and holding until they blended into the sauce. Bean sprouts, cabbage, onions, and peppers could appear as well, depending on the recipe. Every visible vegetable became a separate decision. Behind-the-counter cafeteria chow mein was usually less an attempt to reproduce a particular regional Chinese dish than an example of American institutional cooking borrowing a broadly familiar name. Chinese-American restaurants had long adapted recipes to local markets, and packaged ingredients made simplified versions available to home cooks. School cafeterias carried that process into large kettles and steam table pans. Canned vegetables, prepared noodles, rice meat broth, and thickened sauce could be stored and handled in quantities appropriate for a district kitchen. The dish offered variety without requiring unfamiliar equipment, but it still demanded labor. Vegetables had to be opened, drained, chopped, or measured. Meat had to be cooked safely. Rice needed careful timing. Sauce had to remain smooth rather than forming lumps beneath prolonged heat. The crispy noodles had to stay dry until serving, a task that became more difficult whenever steam drifted across the line. Convenience food never removed the work. It merely arrived with labels that promised the difficult part had already been completed. For some children, chow mein day felt adventurous because it differed visibly from the usual cafeteria rotation. There was no bun, no mound of mashed potatoes, and no blanket of tomato sauce. The crispy noodles offered a texture rarely found beside meatloaf or stew, while the rice and vegetables made the tray look unfamiliar enough to attract attention. Yet the flavors were often restrained. School recipes were designed for broad acceptance, and strong seasoning could create complaints from students, parents, or administrators who preferred meals that offended as few people as possible. The sauce, therefore, tended to be mild, savory, and thick enough to cling to the spoon. Soy sauce might contribute flavor, but exact recipes varied greatly and should not be imagined as uniform. Some students loved the change. Others ate only the rice and noodles, leaving celery and sauce behind. A meal intended to broaden the menu could still produce the oldest cafeteria response: careful sorting, strategic trading, and a final inspection of the tray before dismissal. The name also carried cultural limitations that became clearer with time. Calling one mild institutional mixture Chinese food would have reduced an enormous range of cuisines and traditions to a single cafeteria scoop. Many Chinese American families knew foods far more varied, regional, and carefully prepared than anything served under a school steam table lid. The cafeteria meal belonged instead to a specific American history of adaptation convenience packaging and simplified recipes designed for mass service. Remembering it honestly means recognizing both truths. The dish may have been a sincere attempt to offer variety, and many students remember it warmly. It was also shaped by limited public familiarity and by institutions that often changed foods until they fit existing equipment and expectations. The meal reveals less about Chinese cooking than about how American cafeterias introduced unfamiliar flavors cautiously, translating them into thick, sauce-measured portions and ingredients children could identify without asking too many questions. By the end of lunch, the chow mein compartment looked very different from the moment it had been served. The crispy noodles had softened, stray grains of rice clung to the tray, and the vegetables that survived had gathered along one edge. A milk carton stood nearby, offering a familiar companion to a meal whose name had promised travel beyond the usual lunchroom borders. Some students remembered the golden noodles more clearly than the sauce. Others remembered the celery, the heavy scoop of rice, or the surprise of discovering that they actually liked it. Cafeteria chow mein was regional, inconsistent, and unmistakably institutional, but that very uncertainty helped preserve it in memory. It belonged to a period when school menus were widening while still relying on the same kettles, sheet pans, and serving spoons. Once the last noodles were swept from the tables, the kitchen prepared for a lunch with far less need for explanation. Breaded chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, and vegetables would slow the serving line and make an ordinary school day feel briefly like Sunday dinner. The fried chicken announced itself with breading aroma and a serving line that moved more carefully than usual. In some 1970s cafeterias, the tray received a bone-in piece such as a drumstick, thigh, or breast portion. In others, the kitchen served a breaded chicken piece patty or formed portion that could be cooked and counted more predictably. The exact version depended on the district supplier equipment and number of children waiting for lunch, but the surrounding tray remained familiar: mashed potatoes, brown or cream gravy, green beans, corn, a warm roll, canned fruit, and the required carton of milk. Fried chicken day could make an ordinary weekday feel briefly like Sunday dinner. The breading looked golden beneath the cafeteria lights, the potatoes carried a rounded crater of gravy, and the roll occupied the safest edge of the tray. Yet the meal required attention from the first step away from the counter. A drumstick could roll, gravy could travel, and a tray balanced with one hand while the other protected the chicken was already testing the practical limits of childhood coordination. Bone-in chicken slowed everything down because no two pieces behaved exactly alike. One student received a drumstick that could be lifted easily by the narrow end. Another received a thigh that required a fork fingers or a combination of both. A breast piece looked generous, but could be difficult to manage with the light cafeteria utensils provided. Students inspected the breading immediately, searching for the crispest edge and deciding whether school rules allowed the chicken to be picked up. In many lunchrooms, common sense eventually defeated formal table manners. Trying to remove meat from a bone with a weak fork could turn lunch into a mechanical problem, especially when the chicken shifted across the tray every time pressure was applied. Children who used their hands ate more efficiently, but acquired breading and grease on their fingertips, where one thin napkin waited with entirely unrealistic expectations. The milk carton became difficult to open once both hands were occupied. A friend might help, or the student might wipe the fingers carefully and hope the paper carton respected the effort. The breading determined the reputation of the meal. Fresh from the oven or fryer, depending on the kitchen, it could be crisp, seasoned, and firm enough to crack beneath the first bite. After waiting in a covered pan, steam softened the underside while the exposed edges retained some texture. The earliest lunch period often received chicken closer to the kitchen's original intention. Later groups might encounter breading that had become tender and attached itself more closely to the meat. This was not necessarily disappointing. Some children preferred the soft, salty layer, especially after dipping it into gravy. Others carefully removed the breading first and saved the meat for later arranging the pieces on the tray, with the concentration of a small archaeologist. If the chicken was a formed or boneless portion, eating became simpler, though the meal lost some of the excitement associated with receiving an actual drumstick. Cafeterias valued consistency. Children valued whatever looked most like the piece served at a picnic, church supper, or family table. Mashed potatoes and gravy gave fried chicken day its full authority. The potatoes caught loose breading, balanced the saltiness of the meat, and filled the tray when the chicken piece looked smaller than expected. Brown gravy appeared in many schools, while others used a lighter chicken-style gravy. A generous ladle could reach the vegetables and soften the roll before the student sat down. Green beans were especially vulnerable, their compartment walls unable to stop gravy once the tray tilted. Corn behaved differently, rolling into the potatoes and remaining there until discovered by the fork. The roll served as insurance. It could absorb gravy, hold a small piece of chicken, or provide a safe beginning while the meat cooled. Children who ate the roll first sometimes regretted it after struggling to retrieve the final streaks of gravy. The tray demanded planning bread before chicken, or chicken before bread. Potatoes kept separate, or mixed dessert protected now or rescued later. Fried chicken felt familiar, but it produced more decisions than a hamburger had ever required. Behind the serving line, the meal demanded careful scheduling. Chicken had to be stored safely thawed when necessary, seasoned or breaded. If prepared, locally cooked, thoroughly transferred to pans and held at a safe temperature without losing too much texture. Bone-in pieces complicated portioning because size and type could vary. Cafeteria workers had to decide whether students received a particular cut, whether pieces were distributed in rotation, and how to prevent the final lunch period from finding only the least desirable portions. Breaded patties or formed pieces offered greater consistency, but even those required oven space and accurate counting. Potatoes, gravy, vegetables, rolls, fruit, and milk all had to arrive at the line simultaneously. Popularity increased the pressure. Students who usually carried lunch might buy the cafeteria meal when fried chicken appeared on the calendar, making demand less predictable. A shortage of peas could pass quietly. Running out of chicken while a line of children still waited would become a story repeated through the afternoon. The cooks also understood that fried chicken generated a different kind of cleanup. Pans held breading grease and browned fragments. Trays returned with bones, napkins, loose crumbs, and gravy spread beyond the compartments. If reusable utensils and trays were used, the dish room filled with clattering metal hot water and stacks moving rapidly toward the next service. Bones had to be cleared rather than sent through equipment unexamined. Tables needed extra wiping, and the floor often collected small pieces of breading that shoes carried beyond the cafeteria. The meal's appearance of home-style abundance came with institutional labor on both sides of lunch. Someone prepared every portion, watched every pan, and cleaned every trace after the children returned to class. The students remembered the drumstick. The staff remembered the delivery case's oven schedule portion count, and whether enough pieces remained for the last table. Free Chicken Day lasted in memory because it felt special without belonging to an official holiday. It brought the shape and smell of family gatherings into a school building, then placed them beneath fluorescent lights and a clock that allowed perhaps 20 minutes to eat. Some children remember crisp breading and a warm roll. Others remember a stubborn bone-thin gravy, or the disappointment of receiving a smaller piece than the student ahead of them. Both memories reveal the same cafeteria truth: meals were produced by systems but experienced personally. Every child looked down at one tray and judged the entire day by what had landed there. By the end of the 1970s, fried chicken still stood beside newer burgers. Tacos, frozen foods, and convenience meals connecting the lunchroom's future with its older idea of a proper dinner. The 30 meals had nearly passed through the line, but one final set of objects remained. The cold milk carton, warm yeast roll divided tray lunch ticket serving scoop and cafeteria table would explain why the food itself was only part of what children carried into memory. The milk carton was often the coldest object on the tray, damp around the bottom, and firm enough to slide whenever the student stopped too quickly. It usually held plain white milk, although chocolate milk appeared in some schools on some days, or through separate local arrangements. The small folded top looked simple until a child tried to open it. Printed instructions suggested that 2 paper flaps would separate neatly, revealing a clean spout. Reality offered several alternatives. One side opened while the other remained sealed. The paper tore downward. Milk rose through the wrong corner. A determined student pulled hard enough to flatten the top completely, then drank from an opening that resembled a construction accident. Friends sometimes offered advice, though. Their own carton showed little evidence of expertise. Once opened, the milk accompanied pizza, chili tacos, tuna casserole, vegetable soup, fried chicken, and every other flavor the cafeteria placed beside it. Few adults would design all those pairings deliberately. The carton was there because it completed the school lunch, and children accepted its presence with the same resignation they gave the afternoon bell. The warm roll created a different kind of loyalty. It might be round, slightly sweet pale at the center, and brushed with margarine until the top reflected the cafeteria lights. In some schools, rolls were prepared or finished in the kitchen, allowing their smell to drift through the hallway before lunch. In others, they arrived through institutional suppliers and were warmed in large pans. Either way, a good roll could rescue an uncertain tray. It absorbed gravy from Salisbury steak, broth from beef stew, cream sauce from chicken à la king, and the final traces of hamburger gravy around mashed potatoes. It gave students something familiar while they decided what to do with Swiss steak chow mein or tuna casserole. The roll was also one of the most valuable objects in the trading economy, because it could move cleanly from one tray to another. Canned vegetables required a spoon and trust. A roll required only an agreement. Children who ate it first enjoyed immediate satisfaction, but lost an important tool for the rest of lunch. Children who saved it risked watching someone ask whether they were going to finish it. Beneath everything sat the divided tray, the quiet piece of equipment that shaped the entire memory. It might have been molded plastic, hard and glossy, or another reusable institutional form chosen for durability and repeated washing. Some schools used disposable trays for certain meals or periods, while others relied on heavy stacks that returned each day from the dish room. The compartments promised separation without always delivering it. Gravy crossed into green beans. Fruit syrup reached the roll. Corn rolled wherever the tray tilted. Tomato soup tested the depth of its section, and taco filling ignored borders entirely. Yet those compartments taught children to see a complete meal as a set of parts, entree vegetables, fruit, bread and milk arranged in visible order. A tray could reveal the district's budget, the kitchen's timing, the child's preferences, and the exact point where carrying skills had failed. By the end of lunch, it also recorded every decision. Empty compartments showed approval, neat piles along one edge showed resistance. A clean gravy section suggested bread had performed its duty. The tray began its journey with lunch money, a ticket, a token, a punch card, or another payment system that varied by district. Some children arrived with coins held tightly in one hand. Others carried folded bills, weekly tickets, or identification connected to free or reduced price meals. The experience was not equal for every student, and the lunch line could expose differences that children understood even when adults did not discuss them openly. During the 1970s, school meal access expanded, but local practices still shaped whether payment felt routine, private, awkward, or visible. Some children brought metal or plastic lunchboxes instead, filled with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper fruit cookies and thermos bottles. Others bought lunch only on pizza, hamburger, or fried chicken days. Many depended on the cafeteria every day. That makes nostalgia for school lunch more complicated than remembering whether the corn was overcooked. For one child, the tray was an occasional adventure. For another, it was the most dependable hot meal available. The same milk carton and portion scoop could therefore carry comfort, embarrassment, routine relief, or all four at once. Behind those objects stood the people who made the lunchroom function. Cafeteria workers arrived before children smelled the first sauce in the hallway. They opened cans, mixed dough, browned meat, stirred kettles, filled sheet pans, counted portions, checked temperatures, loaded the steam table, and tried to predict how many students would choose the meal. They served the 30 lunches remembered here, from rectangular pizza and sloppy joes to Johnny Marzetti tacos, fish sticks, vegetable soup and fried chicken. Then they faced the second half of the work. Trays returned with milk still inside cartons, bones beneath napkins, gravy across compartments, and forks hidden under uneaten vegetables. The dish room filled with steam and clatter. Tables had to be wiped, floors, swept pans scrubbed, and tomorrow's ingredients prepared. The meal was inexpensive, but the labour behind it was not small. Convenience products changed the work without eliminating it. Every frozen portion still required storage, heating, timing, serving, and cleanup. Every simple roll had passed through someone's hands before it reached the tray. By the end of the decade, school menus were beginning to lean more heavily toward burgers, pizza, portable foods, prepared products, and greater choice, though the change happened unevenly. Older meals did not disappear at once. Gravy stews, casseroles, beans, noodles, and regional recipes continued beside newer foods. Some of the 30 lunches survived into later decades almost unchanged. Others were reformulated, renamed, replaced, or reduced to occasional appearances. A few remained strongest in one state, county, or district where former students still assume everyone else ate the same thing. What outlived them all was the setting trays sliding along rails serving scoops, striking metal pans, milk cartons refusing cooperation, warm bread being traded across a table, and children measuring time by how many bites remained before the bell. Not every school served these meals, and not every child remembers them warmly. But together, they show the budgeting, adaptation, regional tradition, federal structure, and human labour behind an ordinary noon hour. Somewhere in memory, the rectangular pizza is still warm, the roll is waiting beside the gravy, and one unopened milk carton is being turned slowly in search of the correct corner.